Chapter 933. Shinmu wasn't annoyed and smiled. My hidden sex foundation in the bureaucracy is indeed shallow, but the other clans are different. If you want to pursue relentlessly, will the other clans agree? Yang Fan spread his hands at Chui Lin and said, Boru, you saw it. The hidden sect is obviously using the emperor to command the nobles. They are forcing me to be cautious and forcing the other clans to be used by them. Are the various clan heads willing to be used by the hidden sect? Gu Zhuting pursed her lips and wanted to laugh. Yang Fan seemed to have noticed it and lifted his eyes slightly. He saw two deep pools waiting there with tender affection. His aggressive eyes couldn't help but turn gentle. Chui Lin had a bitter expression as he said to Shinmu, Brother Shin's request is a little unrealistic. I hope that both of you can show some sincerity. Both of you, the more powerful a person is, the more they need to learn to compromise. An overly greedy person will forever be short-lived. When Chui Lin spoke until here, he silently sighed in his heart. The reason why the 7 clans couldn't come up with any strong measures to deal with the obvious and hidden sects was because of the compromise towards the succession hall and the unbalanced internal opinions. The hidden sect was developed by Shenmu alone, and his men were all at the bottom of the hierarchy who couldn't enter the core of the clans. Thus, these people were undoubtedly loyal to Shenmu, and the clan's interference was limited. The clans had a stronger control over the obvious sect, but it was hard to completely stop their actions. Furthermore, as long as the hidden sect didn't stop, could they force the obvious sect to not retaliate and allow the hidden sect to attack? This wasn't in line with the benefits of the various clans. Furthermore, even though the 7 clans were dissatisfied with the obvious and hidden sect's intense fight, the 7 clans weren't completely united. Behind the hidden sect was Longxi Li and Xingyang Zheng, and they hoped that the hidden sect would have the upper hand. Behind the obvious sect was Boling Chui and Zhao Juanli. Originally, there was still the Fanyang Lu clan, and the Lu clan had the dominant position among the 3 clans. However, because of young Master Zhang's repeated mistakes, the hidden sect grew stronger under his watch until they were on equal footing with the obvious sect and even defeated him. As a result, young Master Zhang was ousted. For these 2 years, the Lu clan's influence in the obvious sect had been deteriorating. The current situation was that the hidden sect was backed by Longxi Li and Yang Zheng, while the visible sect was backed by Boling Chui and Zhao Commandery. Taiyuan King and Qinghe Chui were actively getting involved, but they were also clear that the sects were already supported by 2 great clans in the dark, so it would be very difficult for them to get involved. Even if they could get in, they could only follow the footsteps of the other clans. Therefore, their wishful thinking was to mediate between the obvious and hidden sects and work hard to force both sides to reach a balance. Only when the obvious and hidden sects were evenly matched and the 4 aristocratic families behind the obvious and hidden sects were evenly matched would they be able to highlight their usefulness. No matter which faction wanted to achieve something, they would have to win the support of the obvious and hidden sects. Only then would they be able to intervene. As for the Fanyang Lu clan, young Master Zhang was jointly kicked off the throne by the other 6 aristocratic families. As a result, the Fanyang Lu clan's interests were greatly damaged. Now, the Fanyang Lu clan did not trust the other 6 aristocratic families. They had not made contact with any of the parties and had been watching from the sidelines. Obviously, they were waiting for the right time. They would stand out when the battle situation was clear or when both sides had suffered heavy losses. Think about it. How could a group of aristocratic families, each with their own schemes and plans, form a strong control over the succession hall? This time it was only because the obvious and hidden sects had gone too far that they stood out to restrain them. In reality, they did not wish for the obvious and hidden sects to be in harmony. The aristocratic families behind the obvious and hidden sects hoped that their side would win, and the aristocratic families that wanted to intervene hoped that the 2 sects would continue to fight. It would be best if not only the obvious and hidden sects suffered heavy losses, but the 4 aristocratic families behind them would also suffer heavy losses. Then, they would naturally become the dominant faction. However, they hoped that in the arena that they had set, the obvious and hidden sects would be the two gladiators that they would decide the winner and the loser, fighting to the death and not implicating the spectators, sitting on the spectator stands. In this kind of situation, their usefulness could be imagined. Yang Fan and Shen Mu listened to Chui Lin's words and immediately compromised. Shen Mu said straightforwardly, "All right, then our hidden sect will be more magnanimous and take a step back. In the future, the obvious and hidden sects will be on equal footing. However, the obvious sect's monopoly of the salt channel business must be shared with us." Yang Fan smiled and said, "Since Bo Ru is mediating, I have to give this face. I agree that the obvious and hidden sects will be on equal footing in the future. The Longyu trade route that your hidden sect controls will be completely open to us. Who would be willing to give up their vested interests? Even if the two of them were willing, their subordinates wouldn't be willing. Even if their subordinates were willing, the four aristocratic families behind them wouldn't be willing either. Not only were there the results of their many years of operations, but they also had already formed transportation and sales channels. They also had a network of relationships that took countless generations of manpower and resources to build. Furthermore, in this era where transportation was inconvenient, the domains that they controlled relied on their geographical advantage and were controlled in their foundations. How could they allow others to sleep soundly beside their beds? They could expand into new domains, but they couldn't possibly give up the interests that were already in their control. Thus, Yang Fan and Shenmu only acted modest for a moment before they were ready to fight again. Shenmu sneered and threw out his trump card. "Erlang Ran has been in seclusion all this while. I believe there are some things that you are still unaware of. The current emperor has the intention to move the capital. You should understand what it means to move the capital of a country to Chang, and although you have the upper hand for now, when the time comes..." Yang Fan shook his head and said disapprovingly, "Brother Shin, you are not in the imperial court, so you don't know what is going on in the imperial court. Do you think the capital of a country can be moved at will? Even if the emperor makes a decision immediately and really takes action, it can't be done without a year's effort. And a year's time is enough for us to utterly defeat you." Right under Chui Lin's eyes, the dignified masters of the obvious and hidden sects seemed to have turned into two small merchants who had to compete with each other. They were arguing over the gain and loss of every copper coin, or perhaps they had turned into envoys sent by two countries, fighting over every inch of territory, not giving in an inch. But in Gu Zhuding's eyes, her man was very magnanimous. Only that Shenmu was petty. Look, Lang had already said that he could use his influence to prevent the imperial court from carrying out a more thorough purge of the Guanyi Dao's officialdom. How generous was that? The price he asked for was only for Shenmu to open up the western region's trade route. Lang had also said that this matter had already reached the imperial court and attracted the attention of various forces in the imperial court. Therefore, it was hard to guarantee how effective his efforts would be in the end and whether he could stop the emperor from continuing to investigate. But didn't this mean that Lang was open and above board? Otherwise, why would Lang say such ugly words first? But Shenmu was petty and refused to agree. In addition, Lang said that as long as the hidden sects gave up on attacking the obvious sect's influence in the salt tents, he would use the officialdom he controlled to urge the imperial court to pass the proposal of dredging the Hebei province and opening up the Horse Cheek River. This proposal was pushed by the aristocratic families behind the scenes and had long been reported to the imperial court by the Ministry of Works. But due to the depression after the war in Hebei province and the huge cost of dredging the river, the relevant departments had been evading the responsibility. At present, it seemed that there was no hope of it being passed. Once this river was opened, it would directly reach the Bohai Sea. From then on, it would become an important river that could be used for irrigation in drought and drainage in flood. This would have a great effect on the fertile farmland along the river controlled by the aristocratic families in Shandong. Moreover, after it was opened, the imperial court might use it to transport the salt tents. Lang had already generously expressed that the obvious sect would not interfere with the operation of the salt tents. But Shan Mu insisted on getting a share of the salt tents controlled by the obvious sect. It was obviously unreasonable. Shin Mu and Yang Fan were opposing each other with equal harshness and refused to give in. They were like a pair of martial arts experts fighting to the death. If you put forward a request for benefits in one aspect, I will immediately put forward a compensation measure in another. If you put forward a request for restrictions, I will immediately put forward a countermeasure. Chui Lin, who was dizzy from listening, had completely lost all hope. He thought that it was impossible for the two sides to reach a settlement. He could only report this matter to the various clan lords and ask them to personally come forward to mediate. Otherwise, but just at this moment, there was a turn of events. The two sides actually reached an agreement. The two sides decided to put aside all disputes and stop all attacks. After all, this crisis had already reached a stage where it was out of control. If it was allowed to continue, it would be disadvantageous to both sides. Thus, the two sides had to work together to minimize the impact of the imperial court's investigation of the corruption case in Yenzhou on the aristocratic families in Guangzhou. Because the obvious sect currently held the initiative in this matter, they would be playing a greater role. Thus, the hidden sect had to make some concessions in order to appease the people on the obvious sect side. The hidden sect promised that the obvious sect could return to Chang, and the hidden sect would not use the enormous power they had in Guangzhou's officialdom and people to obstruct the obvious sect's return. Of course, Yang Fan also returned the favor and expressed that he would use the obvious sect's power to support the hidden sect in the matter of opening the Horse Cheek River. He wanted the imperial court to pass this proposal. However, this matter was originally the most beneficial to the aristocratic families in Shandong and the commoners in Hebei. It actually had nothing to do with the hidden sect. For some reason, Yang Fan had pushed it into a sea tense that might not have been realized, and it became a great favor to the hidden sect. In regards to this, Lady Gu, who always sided with those close to her, thought that it was because her Lang was smarter than others. Putting aside disputes meant that there would be a day when disputes would arise again. However, at least this fire that was about to go out of control would be controlled. Young Master Chui secretly sighed in relief. After the two sides finally established the agreement, Chui Lin left with Shin Mu in satisfaction. Xiao Ting, help me up. Yang Fan didn't send the guest off. He waited for the guest to leave before speaking to Gu Zhuting. When Gu Zhuting heard him call her, she felt sweet inside. This pitiful and cute little woman finally obtained the love that she thought was purely an extravagant hope. She wanted to become a little dog that could wag its tail as long as she could make her master happy. The words shouting made her feel like she had drunk a jar of honey. Chapter 934. Gu Zhuting quickly went forward and helped Yang Fan up from the bed. After lying down for 3 days, even though Yang Fan had a sturdy body, he still felt a little dizzy when he got up. His body tilted, and his shoulder touched a soft and elastic piece of flesh. Gu Zhuting blushed, but she pretended not to know and just supported him firmly, fearing that he would fall. As soon as Yang Fan looked at the clothes hanging on the bedside, Gu Zhuting understood tacitly. She carefully let go of Yang Fan, and after making sure that he could stand steadily, she went to take the clothes and helped him put them on gently. Gu Zhuting was different from Xiao Man, and An knew deep down she was more traditional than these two women. Therefore, once she made a decision, she would be especially docile and obedient. Of course, this was due to her personality, but she was able to roam the Jianghu at the age of 13 and take the head of a military governor. If it wasn't for the fact that she loved this man to death and cherished his love, how could she be willing to be so submissive? Cherish! Thinking of this word, Yang Fan was momentarily absent-minded. Ning Ku's death had caused a huge trauma to his heart. He now understood a principle, which was to never let what should be cherished turn into deep regret and sadness. Ah Lang has reached an agreement with the hidden sect. We can finally relax for a while. Gu Zhuting knelt on one knee and squatted in front of Yang Fan. She carefully tidied up his robe and spoke delightfully. We have reached an agreement and can relax? Yang Fan was tickled by this naive sentence. He gently held Gu Zhuting's smooth shoulder, and Gu Zhuting stood up obediently. As they were standing face to face, she shyly lowered her head. Her elegant and fair neck was like a swan that was bending down to peck its wings. A smear of blush quickly climbed up her cheeks, and her perky breasts were like a pair of honey peaches that were nodding gently in the wind. The peaches were ripe and waiting for their owner to reach out and pluck them. Yang Fan didn't know why he turned a blind eye to such a good woman and turned a blind eye to her tender feelings. He gently scratched the tip of Gu Zhuting's nose and said intimately, "You! Originally, there were some things that I wasn't very sure about, but today's snort has made me understand something." Because of this intimate action of his, Gu Zhuting's heart was immediately filled with happiness. She gently raised her eyes and gazed at her lover, her heaven, and obediently asked, "What's the reason?" "The so-called alliance is meant to be torn apart. I want them to establish an alliance right here." Wu Zetian stood in the magnificent Tongtian Palace, lightly tapping her dragon crutch, and spoke in a powerful and resonant tone. The Wanxiang Divine Palace that was destroyed by Xue Huai was finally rebuilt. The entire magnificent and majestic palace was rebuilt in its original location, according to its original size and style. However, Wu Zetian had changed the name of the new palace. Wu Zetian, who had always been a little superstitious, always felt that although the fire calamity was man-made, it could also be the will of the heavens. Otherwise, Xue Huai was clearly burning heaven, so how could the fire spread to Wanxiang Divine Palace so quickly? Therefore, she renamed the new Ming Hall Tongtian. The final decorations of the Tongtian Palace had been completed. Accompanied by Shanghai Wanner and the Zhang brothers, Wu Zetian slowly walked in the huge palace with the help of her dragon crutch. The entire palace was brand new, but everything was so familiar. It was as if the Wanxiang Divine Palace that had been destroyed in the fire had been rebuilt by her magical fingers. This gave her an indescribable sense of accomplishment. Zhang Yiji glanced at the joyful expression on Wu Zetian's face and softly suggested, "The saints should hold a grand ceremony to celebrate the completion of the Tongtian Palace." Wu Zetian shook her head and said her plan, "I want them to establish an alliance here." Shanghai Wanner quickly glanced at Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian looked up at the throne high above, as if she knew the doubts of the three closest people around her. She nodded her head vigorously and said, "Yes." Wu Zetian turned around and solemnly instructed Shanghai Wanner, "Tomorrow the court will stop for a day. Pass on my oral edict that the Wu and Li princes will be present at the newly completed Tongtian Palace early tomorrow morning." Ever since the Imperial College's Guang, when libraries professor Su Anang sent the secret memorial through the copper bell, Wu Zetian had been somewhat uneasy. Before this, she had never doubted whether her decisions could be carried out firmly, but now she began to doubt. She wanted to use a ceremony and an oath to bind the Wu and Li families, to prevent them from falling into a war after her death. However, could an alliance really bind others? As a politician who was well versed in trickery and knew the pros and cons, Wu Zetian had never believed in its effectiveness. But now she had no choice but to place her hopes on this method to ensure the stability of the political situation behind her. For a woman who had been strong for half her life, how could it not be a kind of sorrow? Wu Zetian also seemed to understand that the effect of this oath was limited. As she walked towards the palace door, her originally tall and straight chest slowly stooped down. In this magnificent palace that symbolized the fate of the empire and the imperial power, her figure inevitably aged. Shanghai Wanner, who had been by her side since the age of 14, received her guidance and assisted her in governing the country, stared at the figure of the woman she was most familiar with. Her heart suddenly floated a never-before-seen thought. The master of this palace is gradually losing her empire. Wu Zetian stood at the entrance of the palace hall and added another sentence in an old but still dignified voice. "Call Taiping to come too." In the empty main hall, her last sentence echoed. Shanghai Wanner and Zhang Yiji looked at each other in surprise. Zhang Changzong happily chased after her and attentively supported Wu Zetian's arm. He simply could not understand the feelings in Wu Zetian's heart and did not understand what Wu Zetian's words meant. He did not have any talent in politics, but he had appeared in the turbulent, treacherous, and unpredictable center of power. For him, this was really a disaster and not a blessing. There was no eternal thing in the world. The unparalleled, huge tree crown that had opened up to shelter him, a small blade of grass from the wind and rain. How long could it protect him? Tong Tian Palace was like a heavenly temple shrouded in the morning mist. The golden phoenix at the top of the palace was half hidden in the morning mist, as if it had just flown here. Early in the morning, the Wu princes gathered in the palace. In reality, they did not need to come so early, but Wu Zetian purposely stopped the court meeting for a day and issued an edict ordering all the Wu princes to gather in Tongtian Palace. These Wu princes did not know what was going on and could not help but feel nervous. Even the normally lazy Wu princes had woken up early today. Wei Prince Wu Qingxi was seriously ill and could no longer support himself. He also came shakily with his son's support. The Wu princes naturally gathered in front of Liang Prince Wu Sanxi and Wei Prince Wu Qingxi and asked them why the emperor had gathered all the princes today. In truth, Wu Sanxi did not know either, but he was not willing to show that he did not know. As a result, he only shook his head with a sullen expression. Don't ask. When His Majesty arrives, you will naturally know. In the past, Wu Qingxi's influence had been even greater than Wu Sanxi's, but the present was different. The number of people gathering around him was far fewer than the number surrounding Wu Sanxi. Wu Qingxi lightly coughed and shook his head. Wu Sanxi still needed to pretend to be well-informed but inconvenient to divulge information, but he did not even have the mood to pretend anymore. He had fought with Wu Sanxi for half his life, but now, just because his lifespan was about to run out, he had lost all his capital. What else was there to fight for? In the distance, another group of people walked out of the mist. When they saw these people, the Wu princes immediately revealed astonished expressions. They were Prince of Xiang Li Dan and his 5 sons, as well as Crown Prince Li Xian and his 3 sons. Upon seeing this lineup, the Wu princes immediately understood. Today, the emperor had gathered all the princes of the Wu and Li clans. Li Xian had 4 sons, but the youngest was only 6 years old and had not yet been bestowed the title of king. The Li clan's princes stopped when they were 5 or 6 zhang away from the Wu clan's princes. The 2 princes stood on the left and right sides of the imperial path in the middle of Heaven Palace, as if there was an invisible barrier between them. The mist gradually dispersed, but the invisible barrier between the 2 princes did not disappear. On the Wu clan's side, Prince Wu Qingxi and Prince Wu Sanxi stood in front. Wu Qingxi leaned on a walking stick as he strove to straighten his back. The one standing next to him was an enemy, and the one standing across from him was also an enemy. Even if he was about to die, he was not willing to reveal an unsteady appearance in front of his old enemy and become a laughingstock. His son had been pushed to the back by him to stand with a group of princes. On the other side, Crown Prince Li Xian and Prince of Xiang Li Dan stood in front, while the 8 princes stood behind them. The drums on the heavenly gate had already begun to beat, and soon after, the entire city began to rumble. The sun shone down and the mist quickly dispersed, but it could not dispel the gloominess on the faces of the princes. Of course, this gloominess only appeared on the faces of the princes. The expressions of the crown prince and the three princes at the front were completely different. Wu Qingxi had a completely indifferent expression on his face. From the day he confirmed that he had lost the right to fight, he no longer wanted to fight. Wu Sanxi also had a similarly indifferent expression, because he didn't put anyone in his eyes. Prince Li Dan's expression was extremely calm. He looked straight ahead, his hands at his side, and did not move at all. It was like he had already cast aside all worldly matters. Crown Prince Li Xian had a modest and gentle smile on his face. Occasionally, when his eyes met King Liang's, he would even give him an extremely amiable smile. "The emperor has arrived!" With a loud shout, the kings of the Wu and Li families turned around at the same time. Wu Zetian rode an imperial carriage with only a few dozen attendants and guards surrounding her as she walked over from afar. There were no guards accompanying her. On her left and right were the two brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, whose robes fluttered as if they were riding on the wind. In front of the imperial carriage was Shanghai Wanner, dressed in the dignified uniform of a female official, leisurely walking forward. There was another person at Wanner's side. To everyone's surprise, this person was Princess Taiping. Princess Taiping was also dressed in splendid attire, solemn and serene, but also tender and charming. Next to her was Shanghai Wanner, who was as elegant and graceful as a chrysanthemum flower. Chapter 935. Why is Taiping here? The dukes with the surname Wu and Li were all surprised. The most surprised was Princess Taiping's husband, Wu Yuji, who was now both a duke and the emperor's son-in-law. However, they didn't have time to think. Seeing the imperial carriage in front of them, they could only kneel and greet loudly, "Greetings, Your Majesty!" At this time, it wasn't a grand ceremony or worship of heaven and earth. The officials only needed to bow when they saw the emperor and didn't need to kneel. However, the dukes present were all relatives of Wu Zetian. The most senior ones were Wu Zetian's sons and nephews. The rest were her grandchildren and nephews. Naturally, they deserved their greetings. The imperial carriage stopped. Wu Zetian sat lazily in the imperial carriage and looked down at the dukes kneeling below the steps. There were 10 dukes on the Li family side. On the Wu family side, there were 20 dukes other than the unlucky Junwang Wu Yanxiu, who happily rushed to make peace but was held captive by the hateful Mosh. On the Li family side, all the dukes only had one title. They didn't have an army or a horse, and they didn't hold any official positions. On the Wu family side, at least 10 of the 20 dukes led the army. Wu Zetian had never seen the difference in power between the Wu family and the Li family so directly. At this moment, she saw everything. Even she felt that she had suppressed the Li family too much in the past. The hearts of the world were on the Li family side. To ensure her inheritance, the Li family had to stand firm. Otherwise, if she died and the Wu family usurped the throne, her empire would fall apart. She would repeat the mistakes of Emperor Qin and Emperor Wen of Sui. At that time, it would be difficult for her tomb to be peaceful. We must weaken the Wu family's dukes. We must ensure that under their supervision, my son doesn't dare to restore the surname Li or restore the empire of Li Tang. However, we can't let the Wu family dukes have enough power to overthrow the imperial power. Wu Zetian's scrutinizing gaze swept across the princes one by one, and finally stopped on Wu Qingxi. If she had to choose a nephew among her nephews who could replace the Li family and sit on the throne, only Wu Qingxi's ability barely had a 30% chance. However, this nephew with only a 30% chance would probably walk ahead of her. The others were all useless. Wu Zetian lightly sighed and lightly said, "All of you get up." The emperor summoned the 2 princes with the surname Wu and Li to swear an oath to the heavens and earth that they would never betray each other and would never fight with each other. The oath was engraved on an iron coupon and hidden in the Hall of History. Taiping also participated and signed his name. In addition, Enlu has been pregnant for 3 months. After the vow, the Son of Heaven will personally preside over the ceremony and marry Enlu to Chongsun. Wan Er's note, which was only 2 fingers wide and had only 3 lines of words, had already told Yang Fan everything that was going to happen in Heaven Palace today. Oath of alliance? The emperor actually placed the future stability of the empire on a piece of paper. It seems that she really has no other way. Yang Fan sneered. Although he knew the news 1 step earlier than the princes with the surname Wu and Li, the news did not shock him. He only cared about one thing. Taiping also participated. Yang Fan let out a long sigh of relief. He rubbed his chin and thought. The emperor finally opened the ban and acquiesced to Taiping's involvement in politics. This was an important political agreement between the Wu and Li families. The man was in charge of external affairs, and the woman was in charge of internal affairs. Princess Taiping should not have participated. Wu Yuji, as the head of the family, should have full authority to represent his wife. However, Princess Taiping was also able to attend and sign her name on the agreement. This was somewhat unusual. The Wu and Li families had many marriages. Princess Taiping was not the only daughter-in-law of the Wu family. If it was only because she was a daughter of the Li family and a daughter-in-law of the Wu family, then Princess Taiping should not be the only one who could participate in this meeting. It was clear that in Wu Zetian's eyes, her daughter was independent. Not only was she a link between the Wu and Li families, but she was also an independent political force. The emperor increased the number of cavalry from 100 to 1,000 and increased the proportion of old Li Tang officials in the court. These were all to adjust the balance that was heavily tilted to the Wu family's side to a state of balance. However, these forces were obviously not enough. Now, this political balance depended on Wu Zetian's finger to strongly press on the Li family side, which ensured the temporary peace between the two sides. As long as she withdrew her finger, this balance would fall heavily on the Wu family side. The Li family's power was too weak, and Taiping was undoubtedly a person who could play a balancing role. Princess Taiping was both the princess of the Li family and the daughter-in-law of the Wu family. From her standpoint, she would not want either side of the Wu family or the Li family to completely fail. No matter which side was completely eradicated, she would be put in an extremely embarrassing position. Therefore, Princess Taiping was undoubtedly the most suitable person to serve as the mediator between the Wu and Li families. But all along, Wu Zetian had never thought of using her. Even when Yang Fan put him in an important position, she still did not consider her. An emperor who usurped the throne most worried that others would imitate him and usurp the throne. This female emperor was Taiping's mother. She knew her daughter's scheming and wisdom, but she had always strictly restrained her and forbade her from getting involved in politics. Obviously, she was worried that her daughter would imitate her. She had usurped the throne from her son. Because of the constraints of filial piety, even if her son was brave and resourceful, he could not rebel against her. In addition, most people thought that even if she usurped the throne, she would return it to the Li family sooner or later. Because her biological sons all had the surname Li. She was already in her 60s when she ascended the throne. It was impossible for her to have another child, so she could ascend the throne relatively smoothly. But if Taiping also had this ambition, she did not have the advantages that her mother had. If she became ambitious, it would only cause chaos in the world. Therefore, Wu Zetian had kept her daughter tightly in prison and did not allow her to show her fangs and claws. But now she had changed her mind. Obviously, she had realized that if she did not let her daughter do anything, her 2 sheep-like sons would not be able to achieve great things even if they were righteous. Yang Fan's brain worked quickly. Taiping is a woman, so it is difficult for her to directly intervene in the army. It seems that the emperor intends to let Taiping have a role in politics and further strengthen the Li family's control over politics. If that's the case, as for the news in Wan Er's note that Enlu was already 3 months pregnant and had been hastily married, he did not pay any attention to it. He just swept his gaze over and gave a cold laugh in response. In his eyes, That woman was like a strange flower that grew on the island he had lived on for many years. She bloomed in the most beautiful colors, but gave off the stench of corpses that could suffocate people to death. After the Oath of Alliance in the Ming Tang, there was, of course, an emperor's family banquet. Many of the members of the imperial family who had not appeared in the Ming Tang before came, including the brides who had just become the daughter-in-law of the Wu family, and Enlil, who was about to become the daughter-in-law of the Wu family. Princess Anil was dressed abnormally, coquettishly. The feather dress she was wearing was the most popular style in Luoyang. However, the popular feather dresses were sewn with the feathers of birds like golden pheasants. As for her dress, it was decorated with expensive peacock feathers. However, even such a gorgeous dress could not take away her charm. There was no doubt that she was the most beautiful among all the people present. Princess Taiping's beauty was like a dazzling sun. Shangguan Wan'er's elegance was like a gentle ray of moonlight. Princess Enlil was like a seven-colored rainbow that stretched across the sky. Out of the three, she was the younger, the livelier, and in high spirits. She stole the light of all the other women in the hall. But when Wu Zetian's gaze swept over her body, she would unconsciously frown with a faint trace of loathing. This girl was originally the one Wu Zetian liked the most in his grandson's lifetime. But now, she had completely lost Wu Zetian's favor. The peacock dress wrapped around her slender waist. Even though she was 3 months pregnant, her slender waist was still graceful. But there was no need to doubt that she was already pregnant. Wu Zetian was very unhappy about this. An unmarried princess of the imperial family actually did such a shameful thing. It was truly a disgrace to the family. People were always like this. When they made a mistake, they could find 1,000 reasons to forgive themselves. But when their children made the same mistake, they would hate iron for not becoming steel and fly into a rage. Wu Zetian was like this. There was no need to talk about the matter of being a Kirin in the Taizong dynasty. After all, in theory, all the women that entered the palace were considered wives in preparation for the emperor. But this did not mean that she had definitely served the emperor. Every palace maid had the duty to offer their chastity to the emperor. Wasn't it the same after being released from the palace, still married? Kirin was a rank for concubines and also a title for female officials. How many female officials had served on the emperor's pillow? Female officials could be chosen because of their background. For example, they could be chosen from the family of a minister. The emperor had never favored them, but he still had to give them a title to pacify the officials. It could also be because of qualifications, meritorious service, or being used in front of the emperor, but it did not necessarily mean that they had slept with the emperor. Other than the empress and the 4 consorts, the other 9 concubines, 9 Jiu, 9 beauties, 9 Kirin, 27 Baolin, 27 Yunu, 27 Kainu, and the 6 ministers were all wives in preparation for the emperor. Some of them would never have the chance to see the emperor in their entire lives, let alone serve on the emperor's pillow. However, it was an indisputable fact that she kept a gigolo. So when she found out that her daughter had an affair with Yang Fan, although she was furious, she could not display the dignity of a mother to her daughter who followed suit. It was the same now. Although Enlil was unmarried and pregnant, she could not righteously reprimand her. Furthermore, she had to care about the face of the imperial family. She could only quickly let Enlil and Wu Chongshuan marry. However, not being able to reprimand her did not mean that she did not loathe her. In the beginning, she liked Enlil because Enlil was lively and beautiful, just like her when she was young. But she was born into a wealthy family. Before she was chosen to enter the palace, her father was a duke. She had received a good education from a young age, which was different from Enlil. Lively and boorish, naive and shallow, there was only a wall separating them. At first glance, they seemed the same, but with Wu Zetian's experience, she could quickly tell them apart. So, she was no longer as surprised as she was when she first saw Enlil. Because of this, she felt even more disgusted with him. Chapter 936. But when she saw her son and nephews, Her slightly furrowed brow relaxed, and a faint smile appeared on her face. Wu Sansi was raising his cup and patting the Prince of Xiang's shoulder, laughing and whispering in his ear. The two then roared with laughter as they raised their cups and drank. The Crown Prince, Li Xian, was seated cross-legged next to Wu Qingxi, his face filled with concern as he inquired about his condition. The princes were gathered around the prince consort Wu Yuji and Princess Taiping, chatting and laughing. Wu Zetian liked this sort of scene. Although she knew that this harmony was largely due to her presence, it was also true that the relationship between the two sides had greatly improved. If she created more opportunities for them to interact, who said that they could not live in harmony? Wu Zetian smiled as she thought of the leopard cat and parrot she had raised. Leopards and cats could not live in harmony, but the Wu and Li families could definitely live together. Wanner was also present. If Second Zhang could be said to be half a member of the Wu clan because of Wu Zetian, then Wanner was the only outsider at this clan banquet. But of all the people present who had accompanied Wu Zetian as long as she had, her place in the emperor's heart was no less than that of these people who were related to the emperor by blood. In front of Wanner was a bowl of camel trotter soup that was as white as condensed milk and a plate of coin-nosed venison. It was accompanied by fresh elm powder, tender, mellow, and extremely delicious. Wanner had always liked these two dishes, but for some reason, when she smelled the rich fragrance of the meat, she felt waves of nausea wash over her. Wanner gently rubbed her chest. Although she had pushed away the dishes, the smell of the aroma still made her nauseous. Wanner swallowed a mouthful of sour water. She truly could not hold it back. Afraid that she would make a fool of herself by vomiting in the hall, she quickly got up and quietly walked over to Wu Zetian's side and whispered a few words into her ear. Wu Zetian was gazing at her children and grandchildren, nodding and smiling. She did not take Wanner's departure to heart. In her view, Wanner had always been cautious and obedient, which was why she had left early. Today's banquet was the emperor's clan banquet, and the emperor was showing her favor by keeping her. If she really accompanied her until the end, she would not be the obedient Wanner. Wu Zetian smiled and nodded. Shanghai Wanner then floated back behind the screen. She hurriedly walked out of the hall. The autumn wind blew, and Wanner suddenly felt nauseous again. She quickly held onto a pillar and gasped for breath. Only then was she able to suppress the feeling of vomiting. When Fu Qingqing heard that she was about to return from the banquet, she quickly took a few manuscripts and rushed to Wan Er's residence. She was about to speak when she saw Wan Er frowning and her face pale. She couldn't help but ask, "Jie, what's wrong?" Wan Er waved her hand and said, "Give me a glass of water and call a royal doctor." "All right." Fu Qingqing hurriedly put down the manuscript and poured a cup for Wan Er. He then hurried out and ordered the palace maids to call for the imperial physician. Not long after, a handsome imperial physician, who looked to be in his early 40s, hurried in with the palace maids. As soon as he entered the study, he bowed deeply to Shanghai Wanner and said, "This lowly official is the Imperial Hospital's teaching assistant, Yang Yi." Greetings to Shangguan Wanner. In the Imperial Hospital, there were doctors, medical workers, doctors, pharmacists, doctors, and teaching assistants. Above them were the doctors, medical supervisors, medical officials, and imperial physicians. However, these people were mainly responsible for the management of the Imperial Hospital. Specifically, the ones responsible for prescribing and diagnosing illnesses were the doctors and teaching assistants. Yang Yi was the teaching assistant of the Imperial Hospital. This teaching assistant was just 57 years old. Among the white-haired, silver-bearded imperial physicians, he could be said to be in the prime of his life. His family's medical skills were very good. If it wasn't for the fact that the person feeling unwell was the emperor's favorite, Shanghai Wanner, there was no need for him to appear. At this time, Wanner's tumbling heart had calmed down. Seeing that the imperial physician had arrived, she said, "Teaching assistant Yang doesn't need to be so polite. Please sit." Yang Yi picked up a praying mat and sat down on the opposite side of the low table. Wana said, "Chia's spleen is not feeling well today. Just now I suddenly smelled grease and almost vomited. May I trouble sir to take a look?" Yang Yi bowed and said, "Please stretch out your wrist." Wana stretched out her hand. Her green sleeves drooped down, revealing a slender wrist as white as jade. Yang Yi didn't dare to look at Wana. Without looking sideways, he stretched out a finger and placed it on Wana's wrist. He only used one finger to feel her pulse. This was not because teaching assistant Yang intentionally showed off his superb medical skills in front of Wana. It was because he had been showing off for a long time that it became natural. Otherwise, why did he think that at such a young age he was able to surpass many national doctors in the Imperial Hospital? Doctors couldn't compete with each other to determine the winner. The necessary packaging was still necessary. Yang Yi placed a finger on Wana's pulse. After a moment, his expression changed. Wana's eyes fluttered and happened to catch the shock in his eyes. Her heart was also tight. She thought that she had caught a cold in the autumn and hurt her spleen. Although she had called the imperial physician, she didn't care much. But when she saw the change in the imperial physician's expression, Wana couldn't help but be shocked. Could it be that I really have a serious illness? Yang Yi frowned and quickly glanced at Wana. He didn't think that Wana was staring at him. When their eyes met, Yang Yi's body was obviously shocked and almost jumped up. Fu Qingqing, who was standing on the side, was shocked and quickly asked, "Imperial Physician Yang, how is Sister Wana's condition?" Yang Yi hurriedly withdrew his gaze and said in a panic, "Oh, let me see again." Yang Yi put another finger on it, frowned, and felt the pulse for a long time. Then he put another finger on it. After 3 fingers for a long time, he was about to use his whole hand to feel the pulse. Fu Qingqing couldn't help but say, "Hey, Imperial Physician Yang, did you diagnose anything?" Yang Yi's body suddenly trembled. It wasn't a big movement, but he had 3 fingers on Wana's wrist. This slight tremble couldn't be hidden from Wana. Yang Yi avoided Wana's sharp gaze and hurriedly replied, "Waiting for orders is just busy with official business, resulting in fatigue and weak spleen and stomach. As long as the qi and spleen are replenished and the stomach is stabilized, then it can be balanced. This official will go back now and personally get the medicine. After it is brewed, I will send it to waiting for orders." After Yang Yi finished speaking, he hurriedly got up and bowed to Wana and Fu Qingqing. He picked up the medicine box and left. Wana looked at him coldly and saw him hurriedly walking out. When he reached the door, he stretched out his hand to pull it open. His fingers were trembling. Suddenly, his starry eyes focused, and he shouted in a deep voice, "Stop!" Yang Yi was shocked and turned around in a panic. He forced himself to bow and said, "Waiting for orders, what else do you need?" Wana slowly stood up and walked in front of him step by step. Yang Yi lowered his head. There was a faint sweat on his forehead. At this time, Fu Qingqing also saw that something was wrong. She quickly caught up and stood beside Wana, staring at Yang Yi vigilantly. Wana stared at Yang Yi and said in a cold voice, "Assistant Yang, although this is the palace, if I wanted to kill you, it would be like killing an ant. It wouldn't cause any waves. Do you believe me?" The medicine box fell to the ground. Yang Yi knelt down and kowtowed like pounding garlic, waiting for orders to show mercy, waiting for orders to spare my life. This official won't say anything. No, 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 this official doesn't know anything. This official! A strange expression slowly appeared on Wana's face. She said word by word, "You speak. What happened to me?" Wu Zetian only drank 2 cups of fermented rice at the family banquet, and she was already a bit tipsy. As her body aged, her capacity for alcohol was getting lower and lower. But today's family banquet seemed to have made her very happy. When she returned to the lovely spring terrace, there was still a faint smile on her face. Zhang Yiji saw that the Empress was in high spirits today and hurriedly said, The saint is happy today. Do you want to ask the people of the Feng Chen Institute to sing and dance for the saint? They just rehearsed a new song and dance a few days ago. No need. Wu Zetian waved her hand with a smile. There was still a bit of red on her face from the wine, but her eyes had gradually become clear. This bit of wine could only make her feel a bit tired, but it could not disturb her mind. Wu Zetian used a clear and powerful voice to say, I am tired and want to sleep for a while. Send a decree to the Left Assistant Minister of Revenue, Qiu Lingji, Zhang Zhongbua, Qindong, Sun Yuxuan, the censorate Hu Yuanli, Shiyu, Wen Ao, Ho Zhongyu, Chen Yanru, Wu Yizong of the Golden Guards, and Yang Fan of the Thousand Horsemen Camp to come to the Martial Accomplishment Palace tomorrow to see the Emperor. Hearing that the officials that Wu Zetian had summoned actually included the Ministry of Revenue, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Works, the Imperial Censorate, and the commanders of the 2 Imperial Guards, both military and civil, and had no connection with each other at all, Zhang Yiji couldn't help but be dazed. However, he did not dare to be negligent. Before Wu Zetian turned to look at him, he had already bowed and said, Your subject obeys. Seeing Wu Zetian slowly enter the bedchambers with the help of the palace maids, Zhang Changzong immediately came over and said in a small voice, Wulong, why do you think the saint has summoned these people? Zhang Yiji shook his head lightly. Zhang Changzong's eyes turned, and he said, Even you and I did not know anything about this beforehand. This is too confidential, isn't it? Do you think Shangguan Weiji will know? Zhang Yiji had a thoughtful look, as if he had vaguely thought of something, but he didn't say it. He only shook his head again. Zhang Changzong said, How about I go find Shangguan Weiji and ask her? We have always been respectful to her. If she knows, she will give us face. Zhang Yiji's eyes moved a little, and he nodded and said, Okay, you go. I will go find someone to pass on the saint's oral order. The room of in Shangguan Wan was quiet. There was only a pot of blooming orchids on the windowsill, emitting a faint fragrance into the room. The window was half open, and a little bird with green feathers and a yellow beak flew in and stood on the windowsill. It turned its head and pecked the feathers under its wings, curiously poking its head into the room. The study was empty. At this moment, had gone around to the elegant inner room that was partitioned by a screen. She sat on the couch in a daze, one hand stroking her abdomen. The expression on her face was not clear whether it was curiosity or surprise, fear or worry, but also a bit of trance and disbelief. Fu Qingqing was like a headless fly bumping around the room. Occasionally, she would stop for a moment and then immediately bite her little finger nervously. This was a small action when she was nervous, until her little finger was almost bald. Fu Qingqing resolutely said to Wan, Sister, this matter is too important. You must not trust Yang Yi and entrust your life and death to him. We have to kill him. Chapter 937. Shanghai Wanner raised her head and looked at Fu Qingqing blankly. Fu Qingqing said, He is just a medical assistant in the Imperial Hospital. As long as you nod your head, I will immediately take care of this matter. I will make sure his death is flawless and will not arouse anyone's suspicion. Wanner sighed softly and said slowly, It is easy to kill Assistant Yang, but what happens after killing him? Fu Qingqing was stunned and said, After killing him? Nothing will happen after that. No one will know about this matter. Won't you be safe then? Shanghai Wanner stroked her flat belly and shook her head. What about the child in my belly? How can I hide it from others after 10 months of pregnancy? There is no benefit in this matter. Why kill people? I want this child to grow up healthy, safe and happy. I should accumulate virtue for him. How can I let him die before he is born? Fu Qingqing stamped her feet and said, Oh, my good sister, you still want to give birth to the child? How is that possible? After killing Yang Yi, you have to leave the palace with the excuse of visiting relatives. You have to find a doctor who doesn't know who you are to have an abortion. You have to rest for 2 days and then return to the palace. At that time you will be safe. Abortion? Shanghai Wanner's face changed greatly. She hurriedly shook her head and said, No, no, absolutely not. I would rather be smashed to pieces than let others hurt my child. Her lower abdomen was still very flat, but when she gently caressed her abdomen, it was as if she could already feel a small life growing inside. For a moment, her expression became somewhat infatuated. This is my child, my biological child. This is my flesh and blood, the life growing in my belly. Fu Qingqing was so anxious that her face turned red. She walked in front of her and grabbed her shoulder. She anxiously said, Sister, wake up. If you die, can you still keep the child? Shangguanwan, Er's face turned pale. She hesitated for a moment and said, I have served Her Majesty for many years. If I beg her, I believe that even if she wants to punish me, she will consider the fact that I have served her wholeheartedly for so many years and let this innocent baby go. Even if this child is made into an official slave after he is born, as long as he is alive, his father will always have a way to save him. Fu Qingqing sneered and said, Sister, are you saying that when the emperor finds out that her most trusted internal court prime minister, who is in charge of the central affairs and controls the world, has secretly married an external court general who should not have had any contact with her and has a child? Do you think that after the emperor finds out, he will still consider our past relationship and spare your life? Do you think that the emperor is so old that he won't think of something from this? Do you think that an emperor who doesn't even blink when he swings the butcher's knife at his own son and grandson will show you mercy? Wake up at that time. Not only will you die, the child will die. Even Yang Fan will die. Shangguanwan suddenly raised her head to look at Fu Qingqing, her face as pale as paper. Fu Qingqing said anxiously, Sister, if you don't make a decision, you will suffer. Is Shangguanzui here? Zhang Changzong requests to see you. A clear voice suddenly came from outside the door. Shangguanwan quivered and quickly raised her hand to stop Fu Qingqing. She whispered, Wait here. Shangguanwan wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes with her sleeves and hurriedly walked outside. She calmed her emotions and opened the door. She smiled and said, Why did Zhang Fengqin come? Why didn't you send someone to inform me? I didn't go out to meet you. Please forgive me, Zhang Fengqin. Shangguanwan welcomed Zhang Changzong in and invited him to sit down in the study. Zhang Changzong was a very straightforward person. He didn't even need Shangguanwan to ask for his purpose. He didn't even say any pleasantries and impatiently explained the purpose of his visit. Although Zhang Changzong didn't have any schemes, he wasn't that stupid either. The reason why he was so straightforward was because, as the two largest forces in the palace, Shangguanwan and his brother had always been in harmony and got along very well. During the period of their expansion, Shangguanwan had never created any obstacles for them. Correspondingly, they also reciprocated Shangguanwan Oi's kindness and never thought of seizing Er's power. First, the Zhang brothers, who came from the prime minister's family and a prestigious family, were very respectful to this talented woman who also came from the prime minister's family and a prestigious family. Second, it was because of the kindness Shangguanwan had shown them. Furthermore, they also knew that even if they could topple Shangguanwan, they wouldn't be able to control the entire internal court. There was a part of the role that they could never replace even if they had to castrate themselves and become eunuchs. Thus, there was a part of power that they could never control. Although the two sides had never communicated with each other in such a naked manner and tried to figure out the emperor's edict, the two sides had cooperated for a long time and had long formed a tacit understanding. They also understood each other's thoughts. Thus, unveiling this layer of window paper was a matter of course. At this moment, Er's heart was filled with the ecstasy of having her own flesh and blood. She was worried about how to protect this child. Her heart was a mess, and she had no idea what to do. How could she be in the mood to listen to what Zhang Changzong was saying? It wasn't until she heard the name Yang Fan from Zhang Changzong's mouth that she came back to her senses. This matter, Wana really didn't know. Wan smiled apologetically at Zhang Changzong and said, Zhang Fengqin, please tell me again who the saint summoned. Perhaps Wan can guess a thing or two. Zhang Changzong slowed down and repeated the people the emperor had named. Ministry of Revenue Qiu Lingji, Zhang Zhongbua. Ministry of Justice Qindong, Sun Yuxuan. Censorate Hu Yuanli, Shiyu, Wen Ao. Ministry of Works Ho Zhongyu, Qin Yanru. Jin Wu Wei, Yang Fan of Thousand Horsemen. Wan listened with rapt attention and thought quickly. These yamen have civil and military affairs, civil and judicial affairs. They have nothing to do with each other. Why did he suddenly summon all these people together? What is the emperor trying to do? What has recently required these yamen to work together to do? A thought flashed through her mind like lightning. Er's eyes brightened and she cried out, I guessed it. Zhang Changzong happily said, Dai Ji is indeed exceptionally smart. I wonder what Dai Ji has thought of. Said word by word, the saint has made up his mind. He is preparing to move the capital. Zhang Changzong was confused. He still couldn't figure out what this matter had to do with moving the capital. Shanghai could only patiently explain it to him. In reality, the emperor moving the capital was similar to a commoner moving. The only difference was the scale and the factors that needed to be considered. If a family wanted to move, they first had to clean and decorate their new home. If there were rats and cockroaches in the house, they had to first get rid of them. They also had to consider whether the roads were passable and wide. They also had to consider whether the food markets, hospitals, and schools around the new house were complete. The emperor moving the capital was basically the same thing. Wu Zetian had been on the throne for 10 years, but it had been 20 years since the court moved from Chang. Could the palaces and yamen in Chang and still be usable? Did they need to repair and refurbish them? There were more than 100,000 soldiers traveling from Luoyang to Chang. They needed to know the road conditions and solve any problems immediately. Furthermore, there were at least 100,000 officials, family members, servants, and soldiers moving back to Chang. Because the center of the court was moving, the merchants, gentry, scholars, and officials from all over the country had to follow them to Chang. In reality, Chang would suddenly have an additional 100,000 people. Would the road be smooth? The problem of food also needed to be solved. These were the responsibilities of the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of Revenue. As for the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court, was there even a need to say anything? Of course, it was to get rid of the 4 pests. Flies, mosquitoes, rats, and cockroaches were all on the list. Through the case of Yanzhou, the Empress was already very worried about the governance of the officials in Guangzhou. If the officials in the capital were corrupt, it would seriously affect the stability of the center of the court. The emperor wanted to move the capital back to Chang, and, of course, he had to carry out a thorough cleaning in Guangzhou. If the emperor wanted to move the capital, it was inevitable to mobilize the army. This was the most important of all problems. Although the imperial army would be transferred from Luoyang, didn't they need someone from the military to be the vanguard? The placement of the army was also a big problem. The reason why the Northern Office was sent was that the imperial army of the Northern Office was the core army of the emperor and was the army stationed in the capital. As for the Southern Office, the official army was rotated from all over the country to guard the capital. It was not a top priority. Shanghai Ori's analysis was clear and reasonable. Zhang Changzong listened and nodded. While listening, he was anxiously thinking about what benefits the Zhang family could get by moving the capital. Unfortunately, he had nothing else in his mind except poetry, chess, calligraphy, and painting. After thinking for a long time, he still couldn't come up with a reason. Finally, he had to give up. He wanted to go back and talk to the Wulong and let the Wulong make the decision. When Wanner finished, Zhang Changzong, who was in a hurry to go back and deliver the news, stood up. He bowed to Wanner and said gratefully, "Your words have woken me up. I will remember this kindness in my heart. I will repay you in the future." Shanghai Wan also stood up and said with a slight smile, "Zhang Fengchen, you are too polite. You and I are both working for the sage. We want to figure out the sage's mind and also hope to do things better so that the sage can be more relaxed and happy. It is our duty as officials to share the emperor's worries. There is no need to thank me." Zhang Changzong laughed, cupped his hands to Shangguan Wan, and left. Shanghai Wan sent Zhang Changzong off and returned to the study to sit down. She rested her chin on her hand and was lost in thought. Fu Qingqing walked out of the bedroom and said to Shanghai Wan anxiously, "Sister." Qingqing just carefully pondered for a long time. "If we want to keep this child," Shanghai Wan's eyes lit up and said, "You have an idea?" Fu Qingqing said awkwardly, "No. Qingqing's plan is clumsy. I really can't think of anything. Why don't we tell this news to General Yang and ask him to come up with an idea? He is a man. He can't just cause trouble and ignore it." At this point, Fu Qingqing was a little resentful and muttered in a low voice, "These men are the worst. They only care about their own happiness. How can they be so careless?" She was, after all, an unmarried girl. As she spoke, her face turned red. Wana shook her head lightly and said, "No, you heard it just now. He is about to leave Luoyang and has something important to do. How can he spare time to take care of me? Besides, what idea can he have for this matter? It will just distract him for nothing. Don't worry, I have already thought of a way. I will definitely be able to keep my child." At this moment, her black and incomparably clear eyes revealed a gentle and resolute light. In order to protect her child, this woman, who had a temperament as delicate as moonlight, let out a voice that could split the earth and was harder than metal and stone. No one would doubt that if someone tried to harm her child, she would pounce without hesitation like an enraged lioness. Chapter 938. Early the next morning, the fully recovered Yang Fan was about to return to the 1,000 horsemen camp when someone from the palace came to pass on an edict for him to enter the palace. Yang Fan stayed in the palace until almost noon before leaving the palace in a mess with the officials from the Ministry of Revenue, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Works, and the Imperial Censorate. All the officials hurried back to the yamen and rushed to tell the news to their own officials and all the officials who were close to them. The emperor had decided to move the capital. No, it wasn't a decision. He had already started moving the capital. Wu Yizong also attended the imperial conference at Wuchang Hall. When he saw Yang Fan, Wu Yizong's expression immediately changed between green and white. It was as if a large dye shop had opened on his face. However, he did not immediately pounce viciously and bite like a mad dog as Yang Fan thought. This surprised Yang Fan. Yang Fan already knew that the prostitutes and patrons of the brothel had been implicated. From his actions, he could guess that although Wu Yizong would take revenge on him, he would not do so with great fanfare. He had already lost all face in front of him and would not continue to lose face in front of all the people of Luoyang. However, at the time his ruffian and scoundrel behavior had been seen by several court officials. It must have spread in officialdom, so Yang Fan guessed that when he saw him in the palace, he would not have many misgivings. Perhaps he would immediately attack him on the spot, like last time. He had not expected Wu Yizong to know how to endure. This made Yang Fan look at him in a different light. Yang Fan was not afraid of a mad dog that would bark at him endlessly if he stamped his foot. However, if this mad dog knew how to endure and evolved from a mad dog to a poisonous snake, then he had to be on guard. The emperor had not summoned them to discuss matters. He had given them a direct order. He ordered them to immediately hand over the matters at hand and set off the next morning for Chang, and to make preparations for the capital move. When Wu Yizong heard this, he no longer stared fiercely at Yang Fan. His aunt had indeed decided to move the capital. He was one of the advance officials. If the emperor moved back to Chang, and as a general of the imperial army, there was no reason for him to command the army in Luoyang. This army had to be handed over to the southern office. Through the relocation of the capital, the emperor reduced his power and strengthened the power of the political affairs hall. The expansion of the power of the prime ministers was actually strengthening the power of the Li Tang family. Wu Yizong's mind was filled with ideas on how to seize power in Chang. He had no time to care about Yang Fan. After leaving the imperial palace, Yang Fan immediately ordered a personal guard to deliver a message to the 1,000 horsemen camp, telling Sima Shuliang to hand over the Black Tortoise Gate's defense, pack up and prepare to depart from the camp. After sending a personal guard to the 1,000 horsemen camp, Yang Fan hurriedly returned to the Yang estate. As soon as he entered the door, he ordered, "Go, summon Guda, Gu Er, Gu San, and Miss Gu to the study." The Gu brothers' defensive zone was located in the outer residence of the Yang estate. They were the fastest to arrive. Very soon, they stood in front of Yang Fan with their heads held high and chests puffed out. Each of them was in high spirits. When they looked at Yang Fan, their gazes were filled with kindness and joy. They already knew that Ah Lang had slept in their sister's arms and was seen by everyone in the residence. Logically speaking, from their standpoint, they should have beaten this bastard who took advantage of their sister and ruined her innocence. But the three brothers were bursting with joy. They didn't care about the strange gazes of the servants in the residence. Their only regret was that when they found Ah Lang, they were in the bedroom. Moreover, Ah Lang was still sick. Even if he had done something bad, it would be limited. If he had done it on the bed, it would have been perfect. Don't think that the Gu brothers were trying to curry favor with the rich and powerful by pushing their own sister into the fire pit. In fact, they never thought about what benefits they could get if their sister became Ah Lang's woman. They were happy, and they were happy for their sister from the bottom of their hearts. Among the three brothers, the youngest third brother's children were already old enough to buy soy sauce, but their little sister was still living alone with her sister-in-law. She had long passed the marriageable age. The three brothers loved their sister dearly, so it would be strange if they didn't worry about her. At her age, coupled with her status, she was neither suitable for a high position nor a low one. Who should she marry? Now, as long as their little sister was willing to marry someone, and that person was a good leader, they would thank their ancestors. Not to mention that the person was Yang Fan, a young and handsome man with such status. In their opinion, their little sister must be very lucky to have found such a perfect husband. As for the fact that she couldn't be the legal wife, they had never thought about it. With Ah Lang's status, it was already too high for their Gu family's daughter to be his concubine. Even if they were promoted to civil status, ordinary families wouldn't be willing to marry a woman from their family as a wife. This kind of influence could only be gradually removed after 2 generations of good citizens. Moreover, they didn't think that they could kill a person within 10 steps with outstanding martial arts. Being a martial arts master was never a symbol of status and identity in the Orthodox society. Most of the wanderers in the legendary novels had a noble master who couldn't even trust a chicken. Wanderers were the group of people who were the furthest from the social order. They repeatedly preached how they despised etiquette, looked down on the rich and powerful, and ignored the hierarchy, which proved their lowly status and lowly identity. Just like in the era where men were superior to women, there were jealous shrews, but they were pitifully few. Because of this, the occasional appearance of a jealous shrew would be recorded as a miracle by the literati. What was preached would never be what people were used to. They were people of this era, not monsters with water in their heads. How could they have such strange and inappropriate ideas? Yang Fan had seen the martial arts of the 3 brothers. None of them was a match for him, but if it was 1 against 2, he might only have a slight upper hand. If the 3 brothers attacked together, he would definitely lose. Therefore, he trusted the 3 brothers' martial arts skills very much. But when it came to brains, Yang Fan trusted Miss Gu more. Therefore, when he saw the 3 brothers gathered, Yang Fan didn't wait for Miss Gu to arrive and explain the purpose of gathering them. "I have to go to Chang'an immediately. You go back and pack your luggage. We'll leave in the afternoon." The three brothers didn't hesitate and replied respectfully, "Yes." Yang Fan continued, "I'll leave tomorrow. You go ahead of me. There's something I need you to do. I'll tell Miss Gu what you need to do. When the time comes, you just need to listen to your younger sister's arrangements." The three Gu brothers nodded repeatedly, thinking to themselves, as brothers-in-law, we're not as close as our younger sister to him after all. When the three brothers went out, Gu Zhuting, who was dressed in a short green robe, happened to rush over. The eldest brother winked at his younger sister. The second brother gave his younger sister a thumbs up, and the third brother made a face at his younger sister. In the face of her three brothers' friendly teasing, Gu Zhuting's pretty face immediately turned red. She hadn't told her family about Yang Fan's promise to her. She wanted to hide this happiness and joy in her heart and slowly savor it in the middle of the night. She wanted to wait for Ah Lang to fulfill his promise in public and then turn it into a surprise for her family. However, in the minds of the three Gu brothers, apart from being vigilant and experienced when killing people, they were usually extremely simple-minded. Since the younger sister had hugged Ah Lang to sleep for a whole night, her chastity was naturally his. Was there even a need to think about it? He couldn't refuse it. If he dared to refuse, the three brothers would, of course. The Gu family owed Ah Lang a great debt of gratitude that could never be repaid in this lifetime. No matter what he had done, they couldn't use violence against him. But Ah Lang was such a good person, so he couldn't let the younger sister suffer, could he? "Ah Lang," Gu Zhuting said to Yang Fan with a blushing face. Her long eyelashes drooped as she stared at the tips of her feet. Her toes were drawing circles on the green bricks. The shy look of a young girl was exceptionally charming. Unfortunately, her coquettish look was useless to the blind. Yang Fan was lying on the table, holding a brush and scribbling something. He said to her without raising his head, "I entered the palace today. I've received the emperor's edict that I have to go to Chang, and tomorrow morning. I guess I won't be back for a year." Gu Zhuting let out an "ah," and her pretty face suddenly turned pale. Because of her identity as a woman, it was convenient for her to enter and exit the inner residence. She had been responsible for the security of the inner residence, so it was impossible for her to leave with Ah Lang. Ah Lang would be gone for a year. Then Yang Fan continued, "I've just told your three brothers that you will leave with them in the afternoon. Go to Chang and ahead of me and do something important for me." Gu Zhuting's heart immediately flew back to heaven from hell. Didn't this mean that not only could she stay by the best man's side, but she would also be alone during this time? Gu Zhuting, who had just come back to life, answered crisply with a misty look in her eyes, "Yes." Pursing her lips, Gu Zhuting couldn't help but say, "The Empress did not reveal anything in advance," and without the discussion of all the civil and military officials of the imperial court, such a major matter as moving the capital was done just like that. As expected, she was acting on her own volition. She added sweetly in her heart, "The emperor is wise." Oh, Yang Fan, who had been writing, paused and looked up at her. He chuckled and said, "You're wrong about this. Moving the capital is such a big thing, involving politics, economy, military, culture, education, construction, transportation. She also has to convince those princes and ministers who have too many interests in Luoyang and are unwilling to move the capital. It involves too many aspects. The safest way is to use the power of the whole country to arrange it through the court. If it were 10 years ago, no, even 5 years ago, the emperor would have done this. Now she has given the court, I act first and report later. It's not because the emperor is arbitrary, but precisely because she has no confidence to sway everyone's opinion. That's why she decided to set an established fact so that no one can stop her." "Oh," Gu Zhuting answered softly and said with infinite admiration, "Ah Lang really has sharp eyes. I didn't see it at all." She said it just now because she was full of joy, and also because she wanted Ah Lang to think that she was not a female warrior. Obviously, Ah Lang liked intelligent women, but since she guessed wrong, it didn't matter. Which man didn't like obedient girls who admired and worshipped him? Yang Fan was writing with his head down. As he was writing, he suddenly looked up at Gu Zhuting and chuckled, leaving Gu Zhuting confused. Yang Fan noticed Gu Zhuting's careful and flattering mind, but he didn't find it annoying at all. Instead, he was very happy. No wonder when he read history books when he was young, he often found it strange that treacherous officials were known to be treacherous, but the fatuous emperor liked them. Now he understood. Who would like a person who contradicted him all day long and reprimanded him at the slightest provocation? If treacherous officials were as cute as Gu, he would rather be a fatuous emperor. In fact, in the Yang family, wasn't he just an emperor? Chapter 939. Outside the pavilion on the side of the ancient road, several riders were standing under a tree. Yang Fan stood opposite to Gu Zhuting and said in a low voice, "You must speed up the journey. The earlier we set up the plan, the more advantageous it will be for our future situation. Ah Lang, rest assured. This slave understands." Gu Zhuting subconsciously touched her belt. The things that Yang Fan had written for her were right there. She had read them carefully and memorized 70 to 80% of them. Along the way, she wanted to memorize everything on the paper in her mind and then destroy the real thing. A small, careless mistake could lead to a complete defeat. "You must be careful," Ah Lang said. She kept his words firmly in mind. Yang Fan took a deep look at the woman who had already dressed up as a man. She had only changed into men's clothes, but her appearance remained the same. Her pink lips were moist and bright like a pair of red and tender cherries. Yang Fan suddenly opened his arms and gave her a full hug, whispering softly in her ear, "Be careful!" Yang Fan's hug stunned Gu Zhuting. His breath gently blew into her ear, making her feel limp and numb. Seeing this scene, the three Gu brothers not far away were also dumbfounded. It turned out that it really was heavens. When Yang Fan gently let go of Gu Zhuting, she was still standing there in a daze. Just because of this hug, her lips trembled and she couldn't say a word. Her pretty face was flushed red because of surprise and excitement. Only her pair of eyes were bright black like the stars. Yang Fan smiled and softly said, "Let's hit the road. Take care." Yang Fan was well aware of Gu Zhuting's state of mind. She was apprehensive and flattered. Just think about it. She was originally just a dispensable pawn under this sect master, running errands for him at all times. Even if she died, she would be insignificant in this person's eyes. But suddenly, she had become his woman. She was originally a subordinate of Yang Fan, a slave whose soul and body belonged to him. When Yang Fan made a promise to her, she was pleasantly surprised and thought of herself as Yang Fan's woman. But in terms of mentality, she was still half subordinate and half slave. She didn't dare to ask for more. Yang Fan had long sensed her mentality, but he didn't say anything. Words couldn't solve the problem. He could only slowly change her mentality through his attitude and actions. Until one day, she saw him as her man, not a benefactor and a noble. The group of four on horseback quickly disappeared on the road west to Chang. Yang Fan watched them disappear before returning to Luoyang under the protection of Ren Wei and the others. An hour later, Yang Fan appeared in the south of Luoyang. Yang Fan jumped over the wall and quietly appeared in front of Miss Ning's grave without disturbing the boat maiden. On the grave, there was a blade of grass that had just sprouted, swaying gently in the wind. Yang Fan walked over, bent down to pull out the blade of grass, scooped up a handful of soil from the ground, and sprinkled it on the grave piously. The drooping osmanthus leaves gently caressed his shoulder, but he remained motionless. After a long time, Yang Fan sat down in front of the grave, hugged his knees, and leaned against the tombstone beside him. His lips and teeth kept moving, as if he was saying something. His expression was sometimes smiling, sometimes sad. But his soft voice could not be heard by anyone except Ning Ku. The wind blew and fluttered the two ribbons behind his hair net, which rose and fell, playfully slapping the back of his neck. The osmanthus flowers fell like snow, sprinkling on his shoulders and feet. In a very elegant courtyard, there were vines all over the walls, pine and cypress bonsai in the middle, and countless exotic flowers and plants around. Near the window, there was a small pool like the crescent moon, in which several golden carps were swimming under the water lilies. The room was very spacious, divided into different functional spaces by screens. In the largest space, there was a painting of three friends in winter, a painting of fishing in the misty rain, and a few large characters hanging on the snow-white wall. Next to the window, there was a desk made of sour twig wood, on which were all kinds of famous calligraphies and a few precious inkstones. More than 10 fine weasel bristles were inserted in the brush pot. On the desk, there was a celadone vase with several blooming chrysanthemums. Next to the wall, there were a few bookshelves carved by famous artists of different heights. This was a study, but the scholar in the study was not reading. Beauty could only be found outside of books. A beautiful young girl with half-fallen hair and disheveled clothes rested her hands on the desk. Her breasts, which were like 2 small jade bowls, swayed gently in her half-opened green silk gown. It was a very seductive sight. Her pomegranate skirt was lifted up, piled up at her slender waist, and her white tight but still narrow buttocks were raised high in the air. A young boy with a hint of childishness on his lips was dressed neatly, but his pants were pulled down to his legs. His hands were clamped on the slender and soft waist of the young girl, who was squinting her seductively. He gritted his teeth and bumped into her from behind. "Princess, the princess has arrived." Suddenly, there was a cry of surprise in the courtyard, and a green-clothed attendant turned over and bowed in surprise. Princess Taiping's face was as calm as water, and she hurriedly walked past him. Her golden, embroidered skirt with colorful phoenixes and red peonies swayed on the ground like water, and the golden phoenix hairpin on her head did not move at all, as if she was walking on water. Behind her, there were a few fat female sumo wrestlers, and each of them had a fierce look on their faces. "My mother is here." In the room, the handsome young boy, who was sprinting with all his might and was about to climb to the top of the pure land of ultimate bliss, was so scared that his face turned pale. The young girl, who was squeaking on the table, suddenly opened her beautiful eyes wide, and her face was filled with horror. "Open the door!" Princess Taiping pushed the door of the study room and saw that it was closed. She immediately retreated 2 steps. A fat woman walked up and grabbed the door with both hands. She shook the door and suddenly exhaled loudly. She exerted her strength and pulled the door outward. With a rumbling sound, the entire door was torn down along with the door frame. A burst of dust flew, and when the dust slightly dispersed, Princess Taiping stepped over a few fallen bricks and walked into the room. In the room, a man and a woman with messy clothes were kneeling on the ground like quails, and their bodies were trembling. Princess Taiping looked coldly at the man and woman kneeling in front of her and said in a cold voice, "Chong-sun, you are really well read. Every time I test you, you know nothing about poetry, and you talk nonsense on policy. I thought you were talented, but it turns out that your talent is used on this kind of thing." The one kneeling in front of Princess Taiping was her second son, Chong-sun. After Princess Taiping remarried Wu Yuji, her 2 sons did not change their surnames. Fortunately, they did not change their surnames. Otherwise, if Chong-sun changed his name to Wu Chong-sun, he would have the same name as Wu Sanxi's eldest son, Wu Chong-sun, who married Princess Anil. Chong-sun kowtowed like pounding garlic and said with a trembling voice, "I know I am wrong. I know I am wrong, mother. Please calm down." Princess Taiping waved her big sleeves and said in a stern voice, "Come, drag this shameless lowly maid who seduced the young master out and beat her to death." Ever since Princess Taiping came in, the beautiful maid in emerald green gown was scared into a pile of meat paste. Other than trembling, she could not spit out even half a word. Now that she heard it, She was so scared that her liver felt like it was going to explode. She did not even have the time to cry out, "Princess, please spare my life," when a fat female sumo wrestler rushed up and grabbed her hair and dragged her out like a dead dog. Shwe Chong-sun was shocked. He heavily kowtowed to the ground and repeatedly said, "Mother, please have mercy, spare Ali." "Mother, mother." Princess Taiping sneered, turned around and walked away, only leaving behind a cold sentence. "Drag this unfilial son out for me, 20 lashes." The few female sumo servants obeyed Princess Taiping's orders. Even if it was the young master's order, they did not hesitate. 2 more people rushed forward to pick up Shwe Chong-sun and left. In the courtyard, the little errand boy knelt on the ground with his forehead touching the ground, his buttocks raised high. He did not dare to raise his head. Princess Taiping walked past him like floating clouds and flowing water, without stopping for even a step. The little errand boy saw the red dress floating in front of him like a cloud from the corner of his eyes. He had just heaved a sigh of relief when Princess Taiping lightly threw down a sentence from the cloud, smashing him into the 18th level of hell. "Beat this lowly servant who is guarding the door and helping the master to do evil, to death for me." When the steward of the princess's mansion, Li Yi, saw Princess Taiping, he immediately bowed to the side of the road. Princess Taiping walked past him like a gust of wind. Li Yi lowered his head and hurriedly followed behind. Princess Taiping was still angry and asked, "What's the matter?" Li Yi was very well informed. As soon as Princess Taiping went to the study room, he knew that the second young master did not study hard, but fooled around with a pretty maid instead. In fact, he already knew about this matter, but he did not mention it. His master was so smart, he did not know that he already knew about it, so he vented his anger on him. Li Yi was even more careful. He did not even dare to breathe loudly as he said, "Loyal General Yang Fan requests to see you." Princess Taiping suddenly stopped, paused for a moment, and said, "Invite him to see me at the Xingxiu Hall." In the Xingxiu Hall, as soon as Yang Fan saw Princess Taiping's expression, he laughed and said, "The Emperor has just acquiesced in Princess's meddling in political affairs. Princess has already shown your majesty." Princess Taiping's anger had not subsided yet, so she frowned slightly. Yang Fan's words made her burst out laughing. She could not help but say coquettishly, "You deliberately came to make fun of me, didn't you? What majesty? Isn't it because of Chong-sun, that unfilial son? Ai. All day long he does not study hard. He only does those shameful things like fighting cocks and raising dogs, stealing women and stealing jade." Yang Fan said with a smile, "Your son was born with a noble title and does not have to worry about food and clothing for the rest of his life. What are you afraid of? Don't tell me you still expect him to pass the exams and come back as the top scholar?" Princess Taiping rolled her eyes at him and said, "It's easy for you to say. As a parent, even if we can leave an inexhaustible mountain of gold for our son, we still hope that he can have his own ability." Yang Fan was also a father. Hearing these words, he deeply felt the same way. He no longer teased her and said seriously, "It's inevitable that the son of a rich family will be a bit of a playboy. You should not be too strict. Take your time. As long as he has a good character, the rest is not important." Princess Taiping was still remorseful in her heart, but she also knew that because Chong-sun's father died early, she spoiled him too much when he was young and neglected to discipline him. Now that his temperament had matured, it would be difficult to correct him. She could only sigh bitterly and put aside her depressed thoughts. Her bright eyes glanced at Yang Fan and said, "Erling, did you come here for the matter of moving the capital?" Chapter 940. Early the next morning, Yang Fan had to lead the army to Chang, and he had to return to the military camp tonight, so time was tight. But because this meeting with Princess Taiping was very important and related to how the two of them could cooperate with each other in Chang and in Luoyang, Yang Fan stayed in the princess mansion for almost 2 hours before leaving. Yang Fan couldn't tell Princess Taiping about the succession hall, so when it came to Chang, and it was difficult to explain some things clearly. But in terms of grasping the overall situation, Princess Taiping was undoubtedly better than him. From his vague words, Taiping still grasped the key point, so he had a clear idea of what to do next. When Yang Fan left, he saw an ox cart escorted by several servants coming. There was no official banner on the cart, but when the person in the cart came out, Yang Fan glanced at him and vaguely recognized that he seemed to be a Ren Huang of the Hall of Governmental Affairs. Just now, when he and Taiping were in secret, the steward Li Yi came in 3 times to whisper to the princess. Yang Fan vaguely heard some news of a court official visiting. Since Wu Zetian made the oath of alliance and asked Princess Taiping to attend, the sensitive officials understood the emperor's intention. So these days there was an endless stream of officials visiting the princess mansion. Most of these officials were fence-sitters, neutral parties, and wait-and-see parties. Why did they turn to Taiping? Was it because they thought that Princess Taiping, who had just risen, would be the most powerful among the various forces in the court? Or it was just because of Taiping's special identity. She was the princess of the Li family and the daughter-in-law of the Wu family. No matter which party fell, they would not easily kill her. Moreover, she was a woman and would not directly participate in the fight for the throne. Worshipping her as a disciple would not be like those officials who clearly supported a candidate for the throne and had no way out. Because of these reasons, they naturally flocked to Princess Taiping. However, this directly strengthened Princess Taiping's influence. When Taiping's power and influence reached a certain level, would her status and mentality still be as aloof as today? Yang Fan silently walked on his way home. Every time he had a meeting recently, he had a strong feeling that he and Taiping were drifting further and further apart. This feeling was not because he was meeting with Taiping now. It was more because he was studying political cooperation. There was less love between a man and a woman. That was a feeling of the soul. Could passionate love last for 10 years, 20 years, or even a lifetime? No. A pair of lovers after the passion would rely on family, children, and a common life to maintain their love, and eventually it would also turn into family love. But there was no basis for him and Taiping to evolve their love into kinship. Therefore, after the passion gradually cooled down, the relationship between the two of them was more like a pair of confidants, a pair of friends, and more like 2 partners who cooperated with tacit understanding in the business. It was only because of the connection between their souls and flesh that there was more trust and intimacy between them. Under such circumstances, would Taiping, who had lost the shackles of his emotions, grow even more ambitious? Yang Fan was not sure. If Wu Mei had not entered the palace and instead married into some noble family, even the struggle for favor in the harem would not have been so bitter. If she had ultimately become the mistress of a household and not the empress dowager of a country, she would never have become the Wu Zetian of today. A person's fate had always changed according to their circumstances. The times and heroes would always create each other. No one could follow the path that had been determined long ago and walk through their lives without the slightest deviation. Yang Fan did not know whether Wu Zetian's decision to finally break her ban and allow her daughter, whom she had always been wary of, to enter politics was a blessing or a disaster. But at least for now, he had to support her, and he could only support her. Because the crown prince and the prince of Xiang, under the sensitive and paranoid eyes of the empress, could not possibly recruit soldiers like Princess Taiping. When Princess Taiping appeared in the newly completed Heavenspan Palace, standing together with the 30 princes of the Wu and Li clans, she became the greatest hope for the Li clan's revival. When Yang Fan gathered the Gu brothers and Gu Zhuting to make arrangements, the clan already knew that he was going to Chang'an. By the time he returned home, his luggage had already been personally packed by Xiao Man. Xiao Man tirelessly exhorted him again and again, telling him to pay attention to his temperature, pay attention to his diet, and take care of his body. Meanwhile, Anu counted down the days, hoping that when she gave birth, her husband would have a chance to come back. His two lovely wives did not have any hidden grudges against him for his long journey. In this era, the vast majority of men who became officials had to travel thousands of li to serve as officials. As long as their parents were still alive, their wives had to stay at home to fulfill their filial duties. Thus, there were many women who parted from their husbands for several years or even tensome years. Repenting and teaching their husbands to seek the title of marquis was the resentment of countless women who hoped that their husbands would succeed. But when their husbands really did succeed, they felt lonely and cold. Compared to those women, they were already very lucky. Yang Fan picked up his luggage and was about to leave when he suddenly saw his precious son and daughter staring at him eagerly. He suddenly remembered that when he went to see Taiping, she was troubled because of her son's unfilial behavior. A sense of crisis immediately arose in Yang Fan's heart. Yang Fan began to earnestly instruct Xiao Man. The children are not young anymore. After the new year, ask a teacher to teach them something. Our son needs to learn, and so does our daughter. Zither, chess, calligraphy, poetry, singing, morality, character, martial arts. You too should also teach them a little. You don't need to be the enemy of tens of thousands of people, but at least they can strengthen their bodies. You can't spoil the children. Yang Nianzu blinked his big eyes as he listened. He immediately grasped the most important issue in Yang Fan's words. Father, if I learn to read, can I still go out to play? Yang Fan's face turned serious and said, Of course, learning to read is the main thing. If you learn well, I can let you play for a while. If you don't learn well, of course you can't play. Yang Nianzu immediately looked at his mother bitterly. Mother, I don't want to celebrate the new year. Xiao Man couldn't help but laugh. Yang Fan's face darkened, and he became more like a strict father. You haven't even learned and you want to be lazy? When I come back, I will check your studies. If you don't learn well, I will spank you. Yang Nianzu pouted and said, Father, go quickly. If you don't go, the city gate will be closed. Yang Fan laughed and said, Hey, you little bastard, you are driving me away. After being teased by his son, some of the sorrow of separation faded. Yang Fan gently hugged his two lovely wives and said softly, I'm going. Don't send me out. It's a big crowd. Yang Fan turned and walked out of the door. As soon as he stepped over the threshold, his precious daughter, Yang Serong, who had not spoken a word, said, Father, wait a minute. Yang Fan's heart warmed. It was said that daughters were their parents' intimate little cotton-padded jackets. She was only a few years old, but she already knew that she couldn't bear to leave her father. Yang Fan turned around with a smile and looked affectionately at his beautiful daughter, who had her hair combed into two horns. She ran over with her fingers and arranged tasks for him. Father, remember to buy me a mask, a clay figurine, a wooden horse, a whistle, a bamboo dragon, and a pretty little skirt when you come back. After hearing this, Yang Fan said to Xiao Man with tears in his eyes, Wife, educating children is a long and arduous task. There is an ancient saying that a mother taught her children, and Mencius's mother moved 3 times. It can be seen that educating children is very important as a mother. Whether our 2 unlucky children will be successful or not depends on you. There was a very large dock on Ba by Lu Plain. Behind the wide dock area, there were huge granaries. The huge granaries stood on this plateau, like giants that could support the heaven and earth. Below the plateau, there were endless fertile fields. Ba was located at the confluence of the Ba River and the Wei River. The people here relied on the water to make a living. When the flood was in full swing, it could swallow everything in an instant, including your life, your family, your home, and your city. But if humans wanted to survive, they also couldn't do without it. Therefore, even though it would occasionally throw a tantrum, humans still followed its footsteps without abandoning it. Cheng and Luoyang, Daliang, Yi City, Yangzhou, Jinkou. These prosperous cities and Dafu all relied on the banks of the great rivers. Even a small village had to live by the river. The Yellow River flowed through Diaming, so the goods from Jianghuai, Min, and Shu converged here from thousands of miles away. The Yellow River changed its course to the south, and Dayaming instantly declined. The dock of Ba thrived on water transportation, and the main goods transported here were grain. Guangzhou was an important grain production area, but its output was not enough to meet the needs of Chang and city. The garrison in Chang, and the officials who stayed in the capital, the scholars who traveled to study, the rich and powerful families and their servants who gathered here, the students of the Imperial College and the Imperial College, the Buddhist temples, the Taoist temples, and the large number of monks who did not produce after Wu Zetian moved the capital to Luoyang, Chang, and still had a population of 700,000, and 300,000 of them were not farmers. These people needed nearly 6 million don of grain a year, and this did not include the grains needed by the garrison to raise the horses. And how much grain could Guangzhou provide for this millennium-ancient capital? Deducting the fiefdoms of the nobles and dukes, the allotted fields of the officials in the capital, the public fields, the bestowed fields, and the Buddhist fields of the Taoist temples, Guangzhou's annual grain output was about 3 million don. Deducting the grain used by the people and paid to the Chang and granaries as taxes, there was at most 2 million don of grain. Nearly 4 million don of grain had to be transported from other places every year. Because of this, the water transportation prospered and supported a large number of people who relied on water to make a living. These people were called the water laborers, and there were tens of thousands of them. Water was the most unpredictable thing. When it was gentle, it could take whatever it wanted, but when it was angry, it could destroy everything. To transport grain, a group of people had to stick together to fight against the turbulent torrents, the treacherous terrain, the unpredictable weather, the extortionate officials, and the local gangsters at the docks. They had to use their blood, sweat, and lives to transport the grain to Chang, and in exchange for food for their families. Therefore, those who depended on the water to make a living had to unite in order to improve their ability to survive. Thus, they naturally formed gangs. The Shun faction was one of these gangs of various sizes. The Shun faction had more than 200 members and 5 boats. It was just a small gang among the gangs of the canal transport. Their gang leader was Qiao Mu. Gang Master Qiao had been very distressed recently because the Shun gang, which had never been smooth since it opened, had now encountered a big obstacle. Gang Master Qiao, who had even dared to sail through the Sanmen Gorge, which was known as the Gate of Hell, was really desperate this time. He knew that he could not overcome this obstacle this time. At this time his benefactor came. This benefactor was a very beautiful girl. Her surname was Gu. Chapter 941. Gang leader Qiao sat on a stone roller in front of the empty field. Behind him were granaries that were set against the blue sky and white clouds. Arbor was tall and burly. Because he had been working on the ship all year round, his feet and arms were abnormally thick and strong. He looked like a tiger sitting on the ground. However, his face was full of hesitation and worry. This kind of weak expression formed a strong contrast with his burly figure. The Qiao family was considered an aristocratic family in the shipping industry. It wasn't a noble family in Shandong or a noble family in Guanlong, but an aristocratic family in Jianghu. Since the 5th generation, Qiao Mu had been involved in the transportation business. His descendants had been running boats for a living. On Qiao Mu's left stood his second younger brother, Qiao Lin, and on his right stood his third younger brother, Qiao Senator. Standing on both sides of him were the elite backbones of the Shun sect. There were 20 young disciples in total. Unlike the worries of the 3 elders, they clenched their fists tightly, and their angry chests heaved up and down like bellows, as if they were suppressing great anger. Qiao Mu was silent for a long time. Then he let out a long breath and said in a deep voice, "I Ching." A bronze-skinned man with big eyes and thick eyebrows stepped forward and cupped his fists. "Here." This person's surname was Zhuo, and his full name was Zhuo I Ching. He was in his early 30s and was a leading figure among the younger generation of the Smooth sect. Qiao Mu said, If we can't settle this matter today, our Shun school will be finished. This is the foundation of our Qiao family that has been handed down by our ancestors. I am duty-bound to take responsibility for it. I can only pay the death penalty to my ancestors. After I die, you should join the Flood Dragon Union with your brothers." Zhuo Yiqing was unable to restrain his anger and said, "How can the sect leader say that? Which brother of our Shun gate is greedy for life and afraid of death? If worse comes to worst, we'll just fight the Flood Dragon Union. I'll be the first to kill anyone who dares to betray our master." Qiao Mu shook his head and said sadly, "Which one of us doesn't have a family to feed? We have a whole family to support. What are you going to use to fight with them? Can we even fight with them? It was I, Qiao, who was incompetent and could not protect the ancestral property. I, Qiao, will bear all the responsibility. You don't need to worry." In a loud voice, Zhuo Yiqing said, "Ever since I, the one surnamed Zhuo, was born, I have been a member of the Shun men's boat. In life, I am a man of the Smooth Gate. In death, I am a ghost of the Smooth Gate. I can't betray my master and defect to the enemy." The brothers couldn't do it either. "Brothers, they want to swallow up our Shun Gate. Do you agree?" "No. Fight it out with them." The 20 burly men spoke in unison, their expressions unusually heroic. Qiao Mu flew into a rage. He glared at Zhuo Yiqing and said, "I'm still the sect master of the Shun faction. How dare you disobey my orders?" Zhuo Yiqing was extremely terrified. He hurriedly knelt down and said, "This disciple does not dare to disobey, but this kind of order, this disciple cannot obey." As he spoke of his grievances, the huge man actually prostrated himself on the ground and cried loudly. The reason why Zhuo Yiqing was so terrified was not because Qiao Mu was strict. In fact, rather than saying that they were from a gang, it would be more accurate to say that they were from the same clan. As soon as they were born, they inherited their father's position and became members of the Shun family. Qiao Mu was their father's brother and their uncle. When they grew up, they went to work on the boat. Only then did they have a clear hierarchy and were bound by the gang rules. The reason why he was so terrified was because the rules of the water gang were very strict. He could not bear the crime of disobeying orders. Ever since the arrival of the water transport, the river laborers naturally gathered into groups and gradually formed their own set of rules. The water transport gangs were always managed according to quasi-military standards. Every year at the end of January, the river laborers would set off from their homes and sail to Yangzhou. After about a month, they would gather at Yangzhou and load the local grain onto the ships. Then they would continue to load grain from various grain-producing areas. In April, they would pass through the Huai River and enter the Bian River. In June and July, they would reach the mouth of the Yellow River. At this time, the Yellow River was rising. Their ships would wait at the mouth of the river for more than a month. In August and September, when the water level of the Yellow River receded, they would pass through the Yellow River and enter the Luo River to transport the grain to Luoyang. Some of the grain ships would unload at Luoyang, while the others would continue up the river, pass through the dangerous Senmen Gorge, and enter the Guanzhong waterway. Finally, they would pass through the Wei River to Chang, and in this way, they would be floating on the water for 9 months every year. Only 3 months would they be able to reunite with their families because of the frozen river. In these 9 months, they had been guarding their own ship, carrying boatloads of food through the main transportation artery of the empire, supplying it with blood and nutrients. In the army, if a soldier disobeyed a military order, it might not necessarily affect the fate of the entire army. But on a ship, every sailor had an irreplaceable position. Once they slacked off, the whole ship would be buried with them. Therefore, there had to be some strict rules on the ship. They used gang rules that were close to military rules, and sometimes even stricter than military rules to restrain everyone. In the process of sailing, if any troublemaker dared to disobey an order, he would immediately be tied to a stone and thrown into the river to be executed. Even the families of the deceased would tacitly agree to this rule. If someone reported it, the government would also acquiesce to their rules. They would refuse to accept the case because there was no evidence, and the families of the deceased would be abandoned by the whole Chow gang. They would never be able to carry on this business again. They were a group of people who lived under the law, but also dissociated from the law. They had their own set of stricter laws to restrain themselves. They were stricter in carrying out orders and prohibitions than the army. Over time, they formed a special team with gang traditions and military characteristics. That was why Zhuge Yiqing was so terrified when Xiao Mu said that he disobeyed orders. Ha ha ha, touching. It's so touching. I seem to have come at the wrong time. Su Xiaolian, why don't we wait a little longer? We can talk after gang leader Qiao finishes dealing with their family affairs. A sarcastic voice suddenly sounded. The speaker was in his early 20s. He was wearing a short-sleeved shirt, long pants, and leather boots. His clothes were thin and narrow, which made him look as slim as a bean sprout. He had thin eyes and light eyebrows, and his face was frivolous. When he walked, he clasped his thighs and swayed his buttocks like a coy woman. It was Wenbin, the young master of the Flood Dragon Gang. Gang leader Wen had 2 sons, both of whom died young. Therefore, he spoiled his youngest son very much. In order to raise him better, he specially dressed him as a girl. As a result, when he grew up, he also smelled of rouge. Beside Wenbin, there was a middle-aged man in a slanted green robe and a net scarf on his head. He had a mustache, which made him look gentle and dignified. Behind them, there were nearly 100 strong men with their trousers and sleeves rolled up. Their muscular arms and calves were exposed, and their faces were ferocious. Looking at their posture, Qiao Mu was shocked. It seemed that the other side didn't want to settle this peacefully. Qiao Mu braced himself to greet the middle-aged man in a green robe with a mustache. He cupped his hands and saluted him, saying, "Su Xiaolian, thank you for coming." The disciples of the 2 gangs are young and impetuous, and there was a little conflict. Now the harmony has been damaged. Su Xiaolian, you are a person of virtue and prestige. I hope you can come forward to mediate. This Mr. Su was called Su Lin. He was originally a scholar who took part in the imperial examination and was honored as a jurin. He was also a member of the Grain Gang, an important figure of another big gang, the Heavenly Eagle Gang. A weak scholar became an important figure of a big gang and led a group of unruly Jianghu people, which was exactly the characteristic of the Grain Gang, because the Grain Gang was different from the underworld and the underworld. They lived in a gray area. Although they had the characteristics of Jianghu people, they had to abide by the system of the government in some matters. The imperial court had a special organization to manage the collection and transportation of the grain, which led to a complicated system of hidden rules. The peasants handed over grain to the grain transport yamen. The bailiffs, petty officials, and officials who collected the grain tax would exploit them layer by layer, taking advantage of them in the name of donations. During the process of transportation, the officials, petty officials, bailiffs, and odd job workers at the gates would also exploit them layer by layer. If they didn't satisfy them, they would make things difficult for them, not allowing them to pass. If they missed the deadline, the losses would all be theirs. When they stopped at the various docks, the local bullies would also collude with the officials to cause trouble, extorting and extorting. Even when they were on the water, when they encountered official ships and other ships with the right-of-way, the grain boats had to give way. If they deliberately made trouble for them, they could block them at the narrow river, and they would have to wait impatiently behind them. These were not things that these Jianghu people could solve with force, but if they let others exploit them like this, their losses would be too great. In this case, the Grain Gang could only make friends with the gentry and deal with the government through them. The gentry had connections and power in the government, and they had the right to speak. When they came forward, the officials couldn't be as unscrupulous as they were when they directly exploited the people. As time went by, the status of these gentry in the Grain Gang grew higher and higher, and their role became more and more important. Some even joined the grain gang and became one of the leaders of these Jianghu people. At present, the largest few grain gangs all had the participation of gentry, and some were even led by them behind the scenes. Su Lin cupped his hands at Xiao Mu and said with a faint smile, "Gang leader Xiao, the matter between you and him is very tricky. After much persuasion, young gang leader Su has finally agreed to bury the hatchet. However, your Shun gang has to cancel its name and merge with the Flood Dragon gang. From now on, we are on the same side, so a little conflict is naturally nothing." Xiao Mu's expression froze as soon as he heard that. This was originally the condition proposed by the Flood Dragon gang. Su Xiaolian was not mediating, but clearly on the side of the Flood Dragon gang. The more than 20 disciples behind Xiao Mu exploded as soon as they heard that. "You want to annex our Shun gang? No way. We won't agree." "Right. We'd rather die than agree." In an empty field in the distance, a little village girl with a green handkerchief wrapped around her head and a green cloth skirt bent over with grass in her hands suddenly raised her head. She used the back of her hand to wipe the sweat on her forehead and turned her head to the side. As she straightened her posture, her beautiful breasts immediately revealed a moving arc, and her narrow waist concave into a charming curve. "It seems that they are going to fight?" The pretty little village girl looked into the distance and said with a smile. A burly man next to her stood still with the help of a bamboo rake in his hand. He slightly raised the bamboo hat that was pressed down to his eyebrows, cast a cold glance in that direction with a pair of sharp eyes, and said with a frown, "There are almost 200 people. Little sister, can you handle them?" The little village girl smiled noncommittally, showing 2 shallow dimples on her cheeks. "If I can't handle them, you guys can do it." As she said that, she walked with extremely light and graceful steps toward the place where the swords were drawn. Chapter 942. Gang leader Qiao's expression gradually changed from dullness to shock, and then to uncontrollable grief and indignation. His face quickly turned red. Glaring at Su Lin like an angry rooster, he said, "Is this the justice your Heavenly Eagle gang wants to uphold?" Su Lin felt very uncomfortable under Xiao Mu's indignant and disdainful eyes. He said somewhat angrily, "Gang leader Qiao, what kind of justice do you want our Heavenly Eagle gang to give you? A life for a life, and a debt should be repaid. Your men have hurt the men of the Flood Dragon Triad. According to the rules of the underworld, the Flood Dragon Triad should pay back a tooth for a tooth. What's wrong with that?" Xiao Mu said, "Let's not talk about who is in the right and who is in the wrong in this conflict. Now we are the ones who have suffered losses. Dozens of men of our Shun faction have been injured by them, and 2 of our brothers have been disabled, while only 4 of them have been slightly injured. Killing people is just a matter of nodding to the ground. Do you want to push people to death?" Su Lin wiped his eyelids and said gloomily, "Gang leader Qiao, you are in your 50s. Have you lived so long in vain? You have been in the underworld for half of your life. Don't you know this? There is not so much reason in the underworld. Whoever has the bigger fist is the reason. You are not convinced? Your Shun faction has more than 200 men, but the Flood Dragon Triad has thousands of brothers. Even if they use their men, they can still crush you to death. What do you have to compete with them? Listen to my kind advice and join the Flood Dragon Triad. In the future, there will be people to take care of you. What's wrong with that?" Xiao Mu smiled bitterly and said, "Good, good. Su Xiaolian, I appreciate your kindness. I also understand the meaning of your Heavenly Eagle gang. Jianghu, there is no morality in today's Jianghu. I am blind and deserve to end up like this." His words made Su Lin's face turn red and then pale, because Xiao Mu had done the Heavenly Eagle gang a favor. Back then, the old Grandmaster of the Heavenly Eagle faction tried to break into the Sandmen Gorge by force. As a result, his boat was wrecked and he fell into the water. It was Chiao Mu who dived into the water to rescue him, regardless of his own safety. With his excellent swimming skills, he rescued him. Otherwise, the Heavenly Eagle faction would not have existed today. Now that the old Grand Master of the Heavenly Eagle faction had passed away, his son, Wei Yongtang, was sitting on the throne of the Grand Master. Chiao Mu asked the Heavenly Eagle faction to mediate between them. The Grand Master of the Heavenly Eagle faction could not refuse, so he sent Su Lin, the deputy Grand Master. However, instead of helping Chiao Mu, Su Lin added insult to injury and became the lobbyist of the Flood Dragon cult. Su Lin flicked his sleeves and said, "Since you, Gang Master Chiao, don't know how to appreciate favors, then my Heavenly Eagle Gang was meddlesome. From now on, the Heavenly Eagle Gang will no longer be involved in this matter. Leader Chiao, if you have the ability, you can take responsibility by yourself. If you can defeat the Flood Dragon Union, it won't be too late to negotiate with the Heavenly Eagle Gang." Chiao Mu let out a sad laugh and did not even want to take another look at him. It seemed that one more look would dirty his eyes. Speaking of the Shun faction, it had enjoyed a glorious time. In the Sui dynasty, the Shun faction had nearly 2,000 ships and tens of thousands of brothers. Later, the world was in chaos. Zhang Zhongjin, the third son of Zhang Jiling, the richest man in Yangzhou, wanted to conquer the world and recruited soldiers everywhere. At that time, Old Master Chiao was an important member of Curly Beard's team. Later, when Curly Beard saw that he had lost the upper hand, he decisively gave up the fight for hegemony and left the country. Old Master Chiao did not leave with Curly Beard because he had a large number of brothers who depended on him. Most of them had families to take care of. When the Tang dynasty was first established, Old Master Chiao was worried that the imperial court would not allow the existence of such a huge civilian force that could be transformed into a navy at any time because of his relationship with Curly Beard. Therefore, he split the Shun faction and gave his fleet and tens of thousands of sailors to the 8 Vidras, asking them to set up their own faction. The Shun faction only kept a few people and dozens of ships. It became an insignificant, small faction. In the early days of the Tang dynasty, it was the critical period for all kinds of new forces to fill in the gaps left by the previous dynasty's demise. At this time, the strong became stronger and the weak became weaker. The Shun faction did not advance, but retreated and missed the best period for development. When the Shun faction was passed to his grandson, Chiao Mu, it became a small fish with only 5 broken ships. Today, the few gangs on the grain transport river were almost all split from the Shun faction. But so many years had passed. When the Shun faction was split, Chiao Mu's father was just a baby. Now, even Chiao Mu was getting old. As time went by, the little bit of kinship he had with the Shun faction in the early days had long been ignored. However, in any case, the few biggest gangs today were all members of the Shun faction. Now that the Shun faction had fallen to such an extent, there was no need for people to deliberately make things difficult for it. But there was one thing that made people jealous of the Shun faction, and that was their people. When the Chiao family split the Shun faction, they left behind a group of old loaches on the grain transport river. They were the ones who were most familiar with the water conditions and geography along the way from Yangzhou to Chang. And most of those who ran the boats were the sons of their fathers. Their knowledge of the water conditions and geography was all taught by their fathers, brothers, and elders. For those who were not familiar with the river conditions, it was unknown how many times their boats would be destroyed and people would die before they could figure out the key points. Although the Shun faction had declined, it was the only one among all the gangs that dared to pass through the dangerous terrain like the Sanmen Gorge by boat. The other gangs did not have this ability. Take the Flood Dragon cult, for example. They had more than 200 boats, but no more than 20 boats dared to pass through the waters of the Sanmen Gorge. The reason was that they lacked sailors who were familiar with the waters and experienced boatmen. To avoid the boats being destroyed and people dying, their boats could only stop at the wharf in front of the Sanmen Gorge and change to land transportation. How many wagons, mules, and horses would it take to transport the grains by one boat. Not to mention the loss of people and horses, it would take too long. If the Flood Dragon cult could take over the Shun faction, they would immediately have more than 200 sailors who were qualified to sail through the Sandman Gorge. Because of this, although ordinary small gangs were suppressed, it was only for the sake of fighting over resources. Even if they took the initiative to join, it was still unknown whether the Great Channel Gang would be willing to accept them. Only the Shun faction was an exception. An ordinary man is innocent, but treasuring a jade ring becomes a crime. Although all the big gangs wanted to take over the Shun faction, they couldn't take it by force because of the infamy of deceiving their masters and ancestors. Besides, although Qiao Mu did not have a good life, he was unwilling to join other gangs because of the glory of his ancestors. Nobody could do anything about it until the Flood Dragon cult decided to take over them. When the Shun faction unified the Jianghu, the Flood Dragon cult did not exist yet. They had nothing to do with the Shun faction. The once arrogant Shun faction declined day by day, while the Flood Dragon cult grew stronger and stronger, as if they had hit the jackpot. They wanted to go to the next level. Everything else was easy, but good sailors were hard to find. So they set their eyes on the Shun faction. Now was the time when the boats returned to Chang, and one after another. The boatmen rested for 3 months and would go to Yangzhou again at the beginning of the next spring. After 9 months on the water, the boatmen who were free liked to gather together to drink and chat. A few days ago, a few brothers of the Shun faction quarreled with a few boatmen of the Flood Dragon cult in a tavern and then got into a fight. In fact, it was common for these boatmen to fight and make trouble. But this time, they got into big trouble. The young master of the Flood Dragon cult did not let them go. He stopped them and beat them black and blue, then threw them to the door of the Qiao family. Some young and vigorous disciples of the Shun faction could not stand it, so the two sides started a full-scale fight. The Flood Dragon Union had the advantage of numbers. The disciples of the Flood Dragon Union gathered in groups and beat the people of the Shun sect whenever they saw them. After only a few days, dozens of people of the Shun sect had been wounded. 5 or 6 of them were heavily wounded, and 2 of them were probably disabled and could never sail again. Qiao Mu knew that the other side wanted to force him to give in, so he wanted to force the Flood Dragon cult to stop. However, the Life League, the 5 Element Society, the 3 River Society, the Circle faction, and the Taiping faction, which originated from the Shun faction, did not want to get involved. He had no choice but to go to the Tianying faction. As a result, the Tianying faction stabbed him in the back again. Qiao Mu was filled with grief and indignation, but Wenbin said, "Su Xiaolian, you spoke for him out of kindness. My father agreed to let him go for the sake of you, Su Xiaolian." But what happened in the end? His good intentions were treated with ill intent. The other party didn't appreciate his kindness at all. Instead, it made Su Xiaolian feel bad inside and out. "I think you should stay out of this matter, Su Xiaolian. We, the Flood Dragon cult, and the Shun faction will solve it ourselves." As Wenbin said, he waved his hand. More than 200 brothers immediately swarmed forward. More than 20 people behind Qiao Mu did not want to be outdone. Although they were facing 10 times the number of enemies, they also rushed up and tightly protected Qiao Mu in the middle. Qiao Mu shouted, "Go away! The Shun faction is the family property left by the ancestors of the Qiao family. We, the Qiao family, will handle this matter ourselves. It has nothing to do with you." Zhuo Yiqing said loudly, "The Shun faction is the family property of the Grand Master, as well as the family property of all our brothers. My grandfather is a member of the Shun faction, my father is a member of the Shun faction, and I am a member of the Shun faction. When I have a son, he will also be a member of the Shun faction. Now that they have come to bully us, we have to protect our family property, even if we have to risk our lives." Young Master Wen curled the corner of his mouth and snorted coldly. "Why do you talk so much nonsense? It's tiresome. Come on, beat them to death." Chow Mu said sternly, "Wait." Wenbin looked at him and said, "What are you afraid?" Chow Mu said, "Afraid? The 3 brothers of the Chow family will die here today, and I won't even frown. I just want to know, how are we going to fight? How many rounds to decide the winner?" Young Master Wen widened his narrow eyes and looked Chow Mu up and down. Suddenly, he burst into laughter. He pointed at Chow Mu and laughed so hard that he staggered back and forth. "Ha ha ha! This is the first time I've seen such a stupid person. Are you sick? Who wants to fight you one-on-one?" Chow Mu's pupils constricted, and he asked in a deep voice, "What do you mean?" Young Master Wen's face darkened, and he said gloomily, "If we win, we will continue to fight until you disappear from the world forever. If we lose, we still have thousands of brothers. Are so many people just for decoration? We still have to continue fighting until you all disappear forever. Do you understand?" Wenbin raised his hand and pointed forward, then ordered, "Fight!" More than 200 members of the Flood Dragon Gang rushed forward and instantly surrounded the people of the Shun faction. As soon as Zhuge Yiqing threw a punch, 7 or 8 fists in 5 or 6 feet rained down on him. His fist had just landed on the face of a fierce-looking Flood Dragon Gang member, and blood spurted out of his red nose when he was drowned by a storm of attacks. Zhuge Yiqing gritted his teeth and wanted to rush at Wenbin, but he was quickly knocked down. Then it was a one-sided fight. In a flash, he had been kicked countless times. A kick on his lower abdomen made him curl up like a shrimp. Then his ribs were stomped hard, which made him gasp for breath. Then the sole of a boot kicked hard on his face, making him see stars. More than 20 people had no chance to resist the enemies who were almost the same in kung fu, but outnumbered them 10 times. In an instant, they were knocked down to the ground and punched and kicked. Chow Mu's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Staring at Wenbin's hateful face, he waved his iron fists and rushed at him. Wenbin hurriedly retreated. Countless thugs swarmed up from both sides and swarmed at Chow Mu like a tide. Chow Mu used to be very good at fighting. It was not a problem for him to deal with 8 or 10 strong men alone. But that was when he was in his 30s, when both his physical strength and spirit were at the peak of his life. Now he was in his 50s. Time and hardships had not only dyed his temples white, but also bent his spine and eroded his strength. He was like an old male lion, although when he opened his eyes, they were still filled with a terrifying majesty. But his mane was already sparse, his claws were already dull, and he was immediately drowned by iron fists that covered the sky and covered the earth. A foot kicked hard on his leg. The person who kicked him was very cunning. The tip of the boot was made of iron. Chow Mu's legs were still very stable, although he kept moving forward, trying to catch up with Wenbin and bite off his prey's throat with his fangs. Every step he took seemed to be rooted to the ground as soon as he landed on the ground. In the turbulent torrents and huge waves of Sanmen Gorge, he could stand steadily on the bow of the boat. Even if the opponent was wearing iron boots, the kick could not break his leg, let alone make him move. His bones were harder than iron, but the iron-like muscles on his legs still turned black and blue in an instant. He had no time to pay attention to them. His pair of big fists, which were like iron bowls, tried hard to fight back against all the enemies he could see. Iron fists collided one after another, and the sounds were like fireworks exploding. In the crackling sound, no one knew how many people's fists were cut open at the moment of collision. However, even if he was a real lion, he could not break through the crazy attack of so many hyenas. The enemies came one after another, more violent than the huge waves of the Yellow River. In the stormy waves, he could steer the boat, steer the rudder, row the oars, and pull the poles. With his knowledge and control of the water, he could bypass the huge waves, avoid the undercurrents, and let his boat fly through the fleeting downstream. But he could not do it here. He had nowhere to hide or retreat. One of Chow Mu's eyes was purple and swollen, leaving only a slit. His face was full of scars and blood. His body which was as steady as a mountain despite the wind and waves coming from all directions, began to shake. He gritted his teeth, thinking that he had used all his strength in every punch and that every punch was as fast as lightning. But in the eyes of the onlookers, his punches were getting slower and slower and weaker and weaker. All of a sudden, a member of the flood dragon triad rushed to his side. He leaped into the air, twisted his elbow, and hit Xiao Mu's ear hard. Xiao Mu immediately felt that everything in front of him was shaking violently. It was the same feeling he had when he followed his father's boat through the dangerous waters of the Sandman Gorge for the first time, and stood on the deck with a pale face. Puff! Xiao Mu fell to the ground. He didn't do anything to protect himself. His whole body fell forward and fell hard to the ground. However, the thugs of the flood dragon triad didn't hesitate at all. They immediately swarmed up and kicked the unconscious Xiao Mu with countless feet. Before they came out today, they had been instructed by their gang leader. The 3 brothers of the Qiao family must die. How could they hesitate at this moment? Ba Shang was very close to Chang, but right next to this glorious and huge capital of civilization was a dark place where the sun could never shine. Lawlessness was the law of Ba Shang town. The law of the jungle was the rule of Ba Shang town. There were tens of thousands of people garrisoned in this town, which was comparable to a small city, but the imperial court had only sent tax officers and tax collectors. There was not a single public security officer. This was because the government believed that letting the weak be prey to the strong was the best rule. Only in this way could Baishang town form an efficient organization through strong constraints. Only in this way could they protect the interests of the outside world. Only in this way could the problem of feeding Chang's population of nearly 1 million be solved. For this purpose, everything here would be solved by the people themselves. This was not the abandoned land. This was a coliseum designated by the government. Jolin was knocked down. He spat out blood and struggled to crawl toward the direction where his elder brother fainted among the legs that kept kicking out, retracting, and kicking out again. There was blood and tears on his face. The blood and tears were stained with soil and mixed into muddy stains. Suddenly, he saw a dark shadow flash by. Having been born and raised in this special environment on Ba, he immediately understood that it was a foot wearing an iron boot. The tip of the heavy boot was aimed at the temple of Qiao Mu, who had fainted on the ground. It was like a soul-hooking chain poking out of the netherworld, hooking a fragile soul without hesitation. "Big brother!" Jolin screamed in despair. He saw that the tip of the heavy boot was about to touch his elder brother's temple, but he could not exert any strength at all. However, it was so close, and the deadly tip of the boot could no longer touch his elder brother's head. He saw a very delicate boot with delicate patterns on the edge. The tip of the boot was pressed against the ankle of the hatchet man from the Flood Dragon gang. He heard a crack, a very clear sound of bone cracking. Then the foot wearing the iron boot was strangely bent in the opposite direction. The leg was broken. An extremely shrill scream rang out. The feet that were falling on Jolin's head and body like raindrops were also shaken by the scream and paused for a moment. Jolin took the opportunity to raise his head. The blood on his forehead was flowing down, blurring one of his eyes, and his vision was suddenly filled with blood. He saw a pretty village girl wearing a green handkerchief on her head and a green dress standing in front of his fainted brother. Her petal-like lips were slightly curled, and she looked very beautiful. Jolin lowered his head to look at his elder brother again. He saw that the village girl's foot seemed to have moved. He didn't see it clearly, but a phantom flashed in front of his eyes. It seemed that the village girl had moved her foot, and then the few hatchet men from the Flood Dragon gang around his elder brother let out the same shrill scream as the hatchet man whose leg was broken earlier and fell on their backs. They fell heavily on the ground, like loaches overturned on the ground, hissing, rolling, writhing with all their might, and vainly prancing about the ground to relieve the violent agony. Gu Zhuting took action. in the surging waves of more than 200 ferocious hatchet men from the Flood Dragon Gang. Boss Chow, who had sailed a boat all his life, failed to make it through. His boat was destroyed and he died. However, Gu Zhuting was able to break through. She was like a fish, a small green fish. The white flowers on her dress were the silver scales on her body. No matter how fierce the wind and waves were, they couldn't drown a fish. She swam in the stormy waves, and every move she made was waves. Everyone who came close to her, no matter if she gently pinched, softly knocked, or lightly kissed them with the tip of her boot, would fall to the ground screaming. In just a moment, everyone around her had fallen to the ground. Within a radius of several feet, there were people screaming and rolling on the ground. She did not make any fierce or ferocious movements. At the age of 13, she had snuck into the heavily guarded mansion of the governor of a province and silently taken the governor's head. She knew how to kill better than anyone else, and she also understood the weaknesses of the human body better. Thus, her attack was simply a beautiful dance. She waved her hand and knocked someone's joints with her fair fingers. Half of the person's body was paralyzed, and he fell to the ground heavily. He couldn't feel half of his body for a long time. She flicked her index finger, as if she were going to pick a flower. The person who was touched by her fell on his back while holding his throat. He breathed hard, but he couldn't take a breath for a long time. The delicate boots on her feet were also equipped with iron tips, which were more delicate, sturdier than the boots of the fighter from the Flood Dragon Society who wanted to attack gang leader Chow. When she kicked lightly, the tip of her foot would definitely fall on the front of someone's calf, which was the most vulnerable part, the most painful part, and the one that lacked the least protection. Jolin raised his hand and swiped it across his face. He wiped away the bloodstains and tried to get a clearer look. He never thought that anyone could fight against 100 people alone, but now he had to believe it. The little village girl danced and danced as if she was singing and dancing, but everyone she touched fell to the ground with a scream. The people who were attacked by Gu Zhuting were all lying down. Those who didn't believe in evil and wanted to fight with this willow-like little girl also fell down. Thus, the remaining people began to retreat as if they had seen a ghost. Every time Gu Zhuting didn't wait for her to come to their side. She only glanced at them with her pair of beautiful eyes. They seemed to see a group of hornets pouncing on them, and with a honk sound, they fled backwards. Gu Zhuting waved her hands casually, but there was not a trace of arrogance in her expression. To deal with these so-called Jianghu people, she, who was at the top of the food chain of Jianghu people, was more ferocious than a great white shark and more domineering than a tiger coming down the mountain. She could easily catch these so-called masters who could only dominate Baishang town by their weak points, and deal with them in any way she wanted. Who is this little village girl? Jolin thought as he looked at the girl who continued to dance. Those disciples of the Smooth Wind sect who were beaten to a pulp also opened their mouths wide. Some were lying on the ground, some were kneeling, and some were standing. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the beautiful girl who was dancing. There was only one thought in their minds. Who is this beautiful girl? Gu Zhuting finally stopped because she found that the people closest to her had all escaped far away. If she still wanted to fight, she could only chase after them. So she stopped and walked to Qiao Mu's side. She squatted down and helped him up. The expression on her face suddenly became sorrowful, and her pretty eyes were brimming with tears. The culprit who attacked so viciously and made dozens of strong men roll on the ground and scream miserably suddenly turned into a lonely village girl with tears in her beautiful eyes. The village girl held the unconscious gang leader Qiao and cried miserably, "Uncle, what's wrong with you?" Chapter 943. Gu Zhuting's kung fu was not better than that of her 3 brothers. In fact, she was much weaker than them. If she fought with her brothers face to face, she would definitely lose. This was caused by the innate difference of women's physique. Even if she was smart and talented in kung fu, she still couldn't win. But if she attacked secretly, her 3 brothers were no match for her. Stealth and assassination were her forte. In addition, Gu Zhuting's bone-softening skill was unparalleled in the martial arts world. She was also the most outstanding in the Gu family. She could change her body into all kinds of shapes that others couldn't imagine, and through some tiny channels that others couldn't crawl through. She could take someone's life while they were asleep. Her disguise technique was also superb. She could easily turn herself into another person. Even if she turned into a man, very few people would be able to tell the difference. To change into another person, of course, it was not only a brilliant disguise skill. You couldn't change into a tiger by wearing a tiger skin. You also needed vivid movements, expressions, voice, and tone. Therefore, it was very easy for Gu Zhuting to completely change into another woman from inside to outside. She could become an 80-year-old woman with gray hair and a face full of wrinkles. Or she could become a 13-year-old innocent and pure girl. Noble, elegant, cool, charming, coquettish, immature at this moment. There were 2 lines of crystal tears on her cheeks. Her voice was timid and she was bewildered. She looked like a little village girl who had never seen the world. She held Xiao Mu's head and cried, "Uncle, what's wrong with you?" Zhou Lin, Qiao's son, and Zhu Yiqing were dumbfounded. Zhou Lin tried to widen his swollen eyes again and again. He was tongue-tied as he looked at this poor village girl with tears in her eyes. He was not so much surprised that he didn't know when he had such a niece, but because of the huge difference in Gu Zhuting's performance before and after. She is Qiao Mu's niece? How can the Qiao family have such a good fighter? Young Master Wen was aghast. In his eyes, the smooth gate was like a piece of fat meat that could be swallowed in one bite. But when he opened his bloody mouth and stuck out his sharp fangs to swallow it, his teeth hit hard on the hard bone, causing his teeth to fall out. Something has changed. I have to tell father. The timid Wen Bin found an excuse for himself and quickly ran away. Deputy sect leader Su of the Heavenly Eagle faction was also very surprised. A Jianghu master with excellent martial arts might not be a big deal in other places. But in Ba, in this special environment where violence was the only way to survive, he was a powerful force that no one could ignore. Of course, such a force was not the final deciding force in Ba. Although Ba was the world of Jianghu people, the ones who ruled these Jianghu people were officials, eunuchs, and gentry. Many of the leaders of the big gangs were influential gentry in Chang and city. These bumpkins who relied on brute force were always under their control. However, they would not easily bring in the power of the officials. It was easy to invite them in, but hard to send them away. It was not easy to put this place outside of the law. They could do whatever they wanted here, and they could tear off their hypocritical mask and be lawless. But if they really brought in the power of the officials, how many benefits would they have to offer to satisfy those people's greed and make them leave this place willingly? The fact that Shen men suddenly had a super martial arts master was not enough for them to break the rules of Bashang Town and bring in the power of the officials. In this way, they had to reevaluate the strength of Shen men. Otherwise, they would have to find a master who could fight 100 people alone to ignore the sudden increase in strength of Shen men. Su Lin left in a hurry. He wanted to report this matter to the gang leader immediately. When the heroes of Shen men carried their unconscious gang leader, like heroes who had won a great battle, and walked through the busiest street from the dock to the town, there were still countless disciples of the Flood Dragon Gang lying on the ground in front of the granary. They were not unconscious, but they were in the most pain when they were awake. Most of them were not seriously injured to the point of disability, except for the unlucky guy who wore iron boots and tried to attack gang leader Qiao secretly. They did not need a doctor to examine his leg. They could be sure that the unlucky guy's calf had been kicked to pieces, but they could not stand up. That scary little village girl had used just the right amount of strength. Their bones might not have been broken, but they were at least cracked. Without anyone to support them, they could only crawl back. There were also some people who had been hit in the most vulnerable parts of their bodies. They lost the ability to move for a short while. After the people of Shen men left, their terrified companions quietly rushed back. They supported carried them away in a panic. When they also walked onto the bustling street, the people in the inns, restaurants, hotels, and shops on both sides of the street finally understood why the people of Shunmen were so arrogant, as if they had won a great battle, even though they had been beaten so badly. 20 people against 200 people. To be able to beat the other party to this date, they were really king men. Baishang Town was a place where one's fist talked. The people here only respected one kind of people, and that was those whose fists were bigger than theirs. For a moment, as they looked at the heroes of the sect of obedience, everyone's gazes became a little strange. They had never thought that the sect of obedience, which was very amiable and could only rely on the shadow of their ancestors and the faintly discernible relationship of incense offerings in Baishang Town, could actually be so outstanding. However, although it was already shocking that they had beaten the other party to this date, everyone could see the severity of their own injuries. What should they do next? There were still 2,000 people in the Flood Dragon Gang. Unless every one of the 200 men of Shunmen had the ability to fight against 10 people alone, they wouldn't be able to do anything. At this time, people only thought that the heroes who had beaten up the thugs of the Flood Dragon Gang were the 20 men of Shunmen. They didn't think that the pitiful, pretty village girl who had been crying beside the unconscious old gang leader Qiao was the culprit. But when night fell, not only them, but everyone in Baishang Town knew who the real culprit was. The one who beat up the Flood Dragon Society was just a little village girl. That little village girl was gang leader Qiao's distant niece, who had no idea what kind of relationship he had with gang leader Qiao, but was very lucky. "All right, all of you can leave." Gang leader Qiao frowned and ordered his weeping wife and the group of disciples who had been beaten into pig heads. Second brother, third brother, and Tinger stay. Gang leader Qiao didn't have any sons, only 3 daughters. His son-in-law were all from the Shunmen. Second brother had been injured when he was young, so he never got married. Third brother had a son who was smart and liked to study. Therefore, gang leader Qiao didn't let him stay in the gang, but tried to find a way for him to study. The reason why the Shunmen had fallen to this state was because, when they were hiding from the limelight, the backing of the great Sui's officialdom had already fallen. In the newly rising Li Tang's court, there wasn't a powerful force that could help them resist the extortion from the tax officials. By the time things had calmed down and they needed someone to pull themselves together, they had already become a small gang that most of the nobles and officials disdained. It wasn't easy to build a connection, but it would be secretly destroyed by other gangs. Gang leader Qiao knew this very well. At that time, although the obedient sect had declined in terms of power, their name was still there. Those gangs that had already established themselves were worried that the obedient sect would become stronger again, even if the Shunmen had the same power as them. Based on the Qiao family's past prestige and reputation, they had the ability to reorganize all the big gangs. Therefore, under the suppression of all the forces, the Qiao family never had a powerful backer in the government. Now that the Qiao family had produced a scholar, they naturally had to fully support him. Once this child obtained scholarly honors, he would be the Shunmen's greatest hope in the future. Therefore, gang leader Qiao didn't allow anyone to tell his nephew who was studying in the city about this conflict. He was the hope of the entire Qiao family, and he couldn't be sacrificed in this hopeless struggle. The room quieted down, leaving only Gu Zhuding and the 3 brothers of the Qiao family. The 3 brothers were all covered with injuries. Qiao Mu was lying on the bed, and the other 2 brothers were sitting on a stool. Their bodies were all covered with bandages and medicine. Qiao Mu looked at Gu Zhuting, his face turned cold, and his eyes were full of hostility. He said, "Miss Gu, you helped our Shunmen out of trouble today. Our Shunmen are sincerely grateful. But I want to know, what do you want, Miss Gu?" Qiao Mu certainly knew how many nieces he had, and he was even more clear that his family didn't have such a terrifying niece. But just now, he couldn't deny that he needed to give the gang a little confidence, even if it was only temporary. Just like a drowning man, he knew he was exhausted and would sink to the bottom sooner or later. But now, as long as he still had the strength to struggle, he wanted to float on the surface to take a breath. Gu Zhuting saved him and temporarily got them out of a disaster, but he didn't believe that a person would suddenly appear in Baishang town and help them for no reason. Even if this person was a knight-errant who had long disappeared from the streets, he shouldn't be a woman, not to mention that she claimed to be his niece. Therefore, before he expressed his gratitude, he needed to figure out this person's identity and purpose. If this person also had the intention of annexing the Shen men, his gratitude would become a joke. Although Zhou Lin and Shao Xin knew that this woman's martial arts were amazing, they also subconsciously stood on her left and right, forming a pincer attack. When there were only them in the room, Gu Zhuting's soft and timid look suddenly disappeared. She crossed her arms, glanced coldly at Zhou Lin and Xiao Sen's pincer attack, and sneered, "What do I want? I don't want anything, just a Shen men. You treat it like a treasure, but in my eyes it's nothing." Chapter 944. The gentle and weak village girl suddenly turned into a vagabond. Her expression and tone had the toughness unique to Jianghu people, that kind of clear-cut, unrestrained, cold and ruthless without any pretense. At first glance, Xiaomu knew that this woman with changeable expressions was indeed an experienced Jianghu person. With a touch of contempt in her bright eyes, Gu Zhuting glanced at the three people coldly and said slowly, "People in Jianghu should have the awareness of being in Jianghu. If you are not as good as others, you will be trampled on. This is the iron law of Jianghu. I'm not a kind person who will help others when I see injustice. Don't expect me to be a living bodhisattva." Gu Zhuting completely ignored Xiao Lin and Xiao Sen's posture of wanting to pounce on her. She walked forward slowly with her shoulders swaying. As soon as she lifted her leg, her very delicate little boot stepped on the bench in front of the couch. Gu Zhuting bent her waist slightly and looked down at Xiaomu, who was lying on the couch. She said, "I've killed people since I was 13. I don't care about right or wrong. As long as my master wants him to die, he must die. Over the years, countless heroes in Jianghu and nobles in the imperial court have died in my hands. Do you want to scare me with your lousy skills?" Xiao Mu gritted his teeth and said, "I know that you have amazing skills. You won't stand a chance against me. What's more, you saved my life. But why did you come here? Why did you pretend to be my niece? Please tell me clearly. If I misunderstood your kindness, I'm willing to apologize." Gu Zhuting slowly straightened up and smiled. "You're not very capable, but you're quite cunning. Not bad. I did come for a purpose. You're lucky that my master has taken a fancy to you. Otherwise, even if all of you from the Shen faction, young and old, die in the yard today, I won't give you a second look." Xiao Mu's heart tightened. He hurriedly asked, "Your master? Who is he? What does he want?" Xiao Lin and Xiao Sun were also shocked. Such a terrible woman actually had a master behind her. This master only sent one person to defeat the Flood Dragon faction. How terrible was her master? All of a sudden, the three brothers felt a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. They still had the courage to fight against the Flood Dragon gang. But how could they resist this person who had defeated their invincible enemy, the Flood Dragon gang, by sending a timid little woman? Gu Zhuting sneered and said sarcastically, "Gang leader Qiao, you really value the Shen faction more than your life. Don't be nervous. My master doesn't want to swallow your Shen faction, but he wants to help your Shen faction reestablish itself." Gu Zhuting sighed softly and said, "You guys are very lucky. Originally, my master could have supported a slightly larger gang, and that would have saved a lot of effort. But my master accidentally discovered that the Shen Gate was once Third Master's subordinate. As Third Master's successor, my master couldn't ignore this incense." The three Qiao brothers looked at each other, not knowing who this Third Master was. The era of Curly Beard was too distant for them. When Curly Beard was carefree overseas, the three brothers weren't even born yet. But As the overlord of the water, whose old subordinates did the smooth gate belong to, there was only one curly beard. Therefore, this person who was respectfully addressed as third master by their own people and called curly beard by outsiders, was quickly recalled by them. The three brothers cried out in surprise almost at the same time, saying in unison, "Third Master Zhang? Curly beard." Gu Zhuting smiled lightly. "That's right, it's this third master. Other than him, who else is worthy of being called third master?" The three Qiao brothers were stunned. Curly Beard had long since become a legend in their memories. When they were young, they had sat on their grandfather's lap and listened to him tell the story of that strange man. Many years later, when they were already white-haired grandfathers, a man suddenly came and told them that he was the descendant of that legendary strange man. However, if it wasn't for that eccentric Jianghu man who unified the Lulin sect and ascended to the throne of Zongbyo Baizi in the era of the Flames of War, whose descendant could have such unimaginable martial arts, almost in an instant they believed Gu Zhuting's words. Qiao Mu used a great deal of reason to control his shock, but his trembling voice still betrayed the horror in his heart. Your master is the descendant of third Master Zhang? What do you want to do?" Gu Zhuting said lightly, "The smooth gate has been in decline for too long, and the Jianghu has been in chaos for too long. My master wants to unite Ba and unify the Jianghu under the banner of the smooth gate." The room suddenly quieted down. After being stunned for a long time, gang leader Qiao's expression gradually calmed down. He said in a low voice, "You want to rebel?" It was no wonder that he thought so. When Zhang Zhongjian subdued the smooth gate, it was to conquer the world. In the end, he failed and had to go overseas. If the Qiao family hadn't been too close to Zhang Zhongjian, they wouldn't have separated the smooth gate and finally declined to this point. To do great things, one must be prepared for failure. The Qiao family didn't resent Curly Beard because he didn't get the title of king or marquis, but declined day by day. They even admired him. But it didn't mean that they who had never seen Curly Beard would be unswervingly loyal to his descendants just because of the name of Curly Beard and continue to rebel. Gu Zhuting said, "Third Master's era has long passed. My master doesn't want to lead you in a rebellion, but he wants to be your Tsauko. He wants to help you expand the smooth gate until the smooth gate rises again, swallowing all the big Tsauko gangs and restoring its former glory." Restore the smooth gate to its former glory? In the hearts of the Qiao family's three brothers, this was something they didn't even dare dream of. But at this moment, Gu Zhuting calmly said it, as if she was talking about a very ordinary matter. For a moment, they felt a kind of absent-minded feeling. What surprised them the most was that Zhang Sanya's successor actually wanted to be their Tsauko. What was its Tsauko? The smooth gate didn't have its Tsauko today, so it was getting worse and worse. Only those powerful large gangs had its Tsauko. The gangs were divided into two parts, Chaoquan and Tsauko. Chaoquan was the main part of the Tsauko gang. Those Jianghu men who operated boats and struggled in the wind and waves all practiced Chaoquan. And Tsauko was the literati of the Tsauko gang. These literati were not literati who recited poems and wrote essays to show off their elegance. Instead, they were literati who were officials in the official circles or had connections. The word official meant that they had two mouths. Chao Ko meant that they had to fight for a mouthful of money from the government. Only those who had the backing of powerful officials could resist the layers of exploitation and prosper. If they could really find a Tsauko and have a backer in the officialdom, that would certainly be what Xiaomu wanted. But the smooth gate had been coveted for a long time. He still couldn't believe that a big pie would fall from the sky. Qiao Mu said warily, "Is what you said true? Are you going to take the opportunity to annex our smooth gate?" Gu Zhuting blinked her eyes and said, "The flag is still called Smooth Gate, and the sect master is still you, Qiao Mu. Can they still annex you in this way?" Jolin and Qiao Sun looked at each other, breathing a little fast. Qiao Mu's heartbeat also quickened. He forced himself to restrain himself, thought for a moment, and said, "Today you helped us out of trouble, but you also offended the Flood Dragon cult. Maybe they will send more people to retaliate later. Can you handle it?" Gu Zhuting smiled and said, "Otherwise, why would we come here? There are a lot of bullies in Ba. The big gangs are big bullies, and the small gangs are small bullies. In this den of bullies, do you think I'm going to win people over by virtue? Since I'm here, I have more powerful force than they do." Xiao Mu narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Miss, in Ba, powerful force can solve some problems, but it can't solve the fundamental problem. The Flood Dragon cult is backed by the official force in Chang'an. We are not bandits and robbers who live in the mountains and have to live under the noses of the officials. As long as we have a patrol inspector and a few constables, no matter how powerful your force is, it will be useless." Gu Zhuting shook her head gently and said with pity, "No wonder the Smooth Gate has fallen into such a situation today. Gang leader Qiao is really not smart enough. As I said just now, my master is going to be your Tsauko. How can you be a Tsauko if you don't have some power in the officialdom?" Xiao Mu's eyes finally lit up. He said nervously, "Your master is an official? Can he compare with the backing of the Flood Dragon cult?" Gu Zhuting asked, "Do you know who's backing the Flood Dragon cult?" Xiao Mu was stunned. He shook his head and said, "I don't know. This kind of thing has always been the top secret of the Tsauko gang. How can others know?" Gu Zhuting smiled, stretched out a slender finger that was as white as green jade, and pointed at the tip of her nose. She said, "I know. The official backing of the Flood Dragon cult is Chu Tianqing, the military counselor of Chang'an. When I came here, I already informed the Dugu family of Guanren Lane. They will send someone to knock that military counselor Chu down." Hearing that, gang leader Qiao opened his mouth like a hippopotamus. He cried out involuntarily, "The Dugu family of Guanren Lane. Your master is from the Dugu family?" Jolin and Qiao Sen also gasped like bellows. The Dugu family? They never expected that the Dugu family was the one who had taken a fancy to the Smooth Gate. If Curly Beard was just a legend in legends, then the Dugu family was a legend in reality. Would such a lofty and unreachable family lower their heads to look down on these small ants in Baishang Town? They were just worried that they would be swallowed up by others. How ridiculous! A millionaire who was as rich as a country suddenly showed kindness and wanted to throw a piece of gold into their broken bowl that only had a few copper coins in it. They actually hugged the broken bowl tightly, worried that the few copper coins would be snatched by someone else. If they had the Dugu family as their backer, the great happiness made the three experienced Jianghu people involuntarily tremble. They were already moved to tears, but Gu Zhuting knocked them out with her hammer again. "The Dugu family? I didn't say I was from the Dugu family. To be precise, the Dugu family is my master's man." Xiao Mu trembled all over and asked, "Who is your master?" "He. Where is he? I want to pay my respects to him immediately." Gu Zhuting said sweetly, "My master? He will be here in a day or two." Speaking of this, Gu Zhuting felt an indescribable joy in her heart, as if the flowers in her heart were about to bloom. She couldn't help but tremble. "A Lang will be here soon, soon." Chapter 945. The valley was deep and dangerous. The long ancient road was only wide enough for one carriage to pass through. A snake-like group of people and horses slowly walked through the narrow valley. On both sides of the mountain was a peach forest that stretched for hundreds of miles. In late autumn, all the leaves had fallen off. When a gust of wind blew, the withered branches would shiver in the wind. 1,000 cavalrymen, fully equipped with saddles and swords, rode tall and strong horses. In the middle of the procession were several carriages carrying a few civil officials who could not bear to travel long distances on horseback. Chun Dong and Sun Yuxuan from the Ministry of Justice, Hu Yuanli, Shiyu, and Wen Ao from the Ministry of Censorate went with Wu Yizong. As for Qiu Lingji from the Ministry of Revenue, Zhang Zhongbo from the Ministry of Granaries, and Hou Zhongyu and Qin Yanru from the Ministry of Works, they all followed Wu Yizong from the Golden Guards. Wu Yizong roped in the officials from the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Works to his side. One of these two yamens would be responsible for the renovation of the old capital of Chang, and thus controlling large amounts of funds and workers. The other yamen would be responsible for the census and statistics of the people of Chang, and directly controlling the household registration and tax situation. Wu Yizong clearly wanted to grasp the key points by taking control of the population, tax allocation of funds, and construction. He wanted to control these two yamens along the way by using both carrot and stick. Qiu Lingji from the Ministry of Revenue was his in-law, so he would definitely cooperate with him. He only needed to work hard to win over the Ministry of Works. Although the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Censorate did not care about money or people, they were responsible for fixing people. The aftermath of the corruption case in Yanzhou was rippling, and the emperor was about to return to Chang. Chang and's public security was bound to be greatly improved. The Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court would play a major role in this. Because of this, as long as Wu Yizong controlled the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court, he could monopolize all the governance of the old capital and completely exclude Yangfan. However, the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court had always been close to Yangfan. This time, the people from the two yamens clearly rejected his invitation and went with Yangfan. Perhaps Wu Zetian had already thought of this result when she transferred these people over. She had deliberately transferred these people over to create this kind of situation, balance. In Wu Zetian's heart, the Wu family was still the most trusted and most willing to use. Moreover, the reduction of Wu Yizong's military power was also a disguised form of compensation. Wu Yizong would spare no effort to rope in the officials of the Ministry of Works. The assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Qiu Lingji, was his relative and would definitely cooperate fully. There were many areas in which the Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Works would need to work closely together in the future. However, she was also worried that these people would do whatever they wanted and ruin the country's plans. She needed someone to strictly monitor and restrain Wu Yizong's power, so she specially transferred a few officials who were close to Yangfan from the Ministry of Justice and the Imperial Censorate. When these people left, they must have been instructed by her personally. Imperial Censor sat alone in a carriage and walked behind in a sickly state. He had not shown himself many times along the way and was very depressed. Originally, he and Hu Yuanli were the most popular candidates for the position of Deputy Imperial Censor. Unfortunately, during the trip to Danzhou, he fell into a honey trap and was played by Miss Fang Dian. In the end, he missed a good opportunity. Following Zhang Changzong and Yang Fan's actions in Yanzhou, Hu Yuanli also solved the grain embezzlement case while overseeing Fengzhou. However, because the evidence had fallen into someone else's hands, he could not do anything. In the end, because of the Yanzhou case, the provincial governor of Danzhou, Li Junfeng, was unable to escape the law, but he did not have any credit. If it wasn't for the fact that Li Junfeng did not want to add another crime of framing the imperial censor, he would have lost all his reputation and been removed from office. Imperial censor could only watch sadly as Hu Yuanli took advantage of this opportunity to sit on the throne of deputy imperial censor. However, he became a capable subordinate of Hu Yuanli and came to Chang and with him. What made him even sadder was that if he had really slept with Provincial Governor Li's Madame Ru, he would have vented most of his anger. However, it was not until Li Junfeng was caught by the law that he found out that Madame Ru was actually a famous prostitute from a brothel that Li Junfeng had found. With such an unbearable situation, imperial censorship was naturally depressed. In front of them, a large carriage was very lively. Qin Dong, the Minister of Justice, and Hu Yuanli, the Deputy Imperial Censor, were sitting opposite each other and playing chess. Yang Fan and Sun Yuxuan were sitting on the left and right respectively, watching the game. The two people watching the game did not have the slightest intention of watching the game without saying anything. From time to time, they would comment on the two people playing chess. The four people chatted and laughed, and the atmosphere was very harmonious. The wheels of the carriage rolled and squeaked as they traveled on the ancient road of Chang. From time to time, the tall wheels would roll up a few withered leaves and fly in the rustling autumn wind. The carriage suddenly stopped and the curtain was lifted, when Ao walked in with a plate of glistening yellow oranges. He nodded and bowed as he said, "Hu Xian, General Yang, Chun Xianling, Sun Xianling, please eat some oranges. I bought them at the intersection just now. They can clear the body heat and improve the stomach." When the group of cruel officials was running amok in the imperial censorate, this imperial censorship was only a lackey of those cruel officials. After that group of cruel officials was swept away, this imperial censorship was spared. This group of new officials were not cruel officials, so the imperial censor naturally did not dare to do evil. However, his personality of loving to flatter others still did not change. When Ao always used respectful terms to address the few high-ranking officials. Yang Fan's rank was higher than Hu Yuanli's, but Hu Yuanli was his superior. Therefore, when the few people were in the carriage, he would always greet his superior respectfully first before greeting the other officials according to their rank. Yang Fan smiled and took the plate. He said to Wen Ao, "Thank you, Imperial Censorship." When Ao felt as if his bones were lighter after receiving his thanks, he hurriedly said, "It's my pleasure, my pleasure." The imperial censor stood aside and glanced at the chessboard. He smiled and said, "Oh, Hu Xianxian is really good at chess. I am afraid Chun Xianling will not be able to turn the tables this time." Qin Dong snorted with a dark face. He looked very unhappy. When Ao laughed awkwardly, he had achieved his goal of flattering Qin Dong. He nodded and bowed and left. As soon as the imperial censorship left, Yang Fan laughed and said, "You are bad at chess. Why are you showing your face to the imperial censorship? What do you think? I told you not to go straight for the heart at the beginning of the game, but you didn't listen. Now you can't go on, can you?" Chen Dong glanced out of the window and said unhappily, "We have passed the Hanga Pass and will reach Chang'an soon. The king of Hanoi has already started recruiting people as soon as he left Luoyang. Why are you still in the mood to point fingers here?" Yang Fan smiled and said, "What is there to be anxious about? The trip to Chang, and is just like the game you played with Brother Hu. It doesn't matter who takes the lead. Chess is a game of encirclement. The key to victory lies in the encirclement and the encirclement. We are still at the stage of setting up the game. As long as we have a good opening, why should we let him take the lead?" As he spoke, Yang Fan peeled an orange and put a piece into his mouth. The sweet and sour juice immediately flowed down his throat. Chun Dong glanced at him and said, "It seems like you have a card up your sleeve." Yang Fan smiled and said, "If it was King Wei who came this time, I wouldn't dare to say that I have a card up my sleeve. Even if it was King Liang, I wouldn't dare to say that I have 100% certainty. But since it is this pig-riding general who came, do you think I am more stupid than a pig?" Yang Fan pointed at the chessboard and said, "Being too solid and too firm, nitpicking and blindly consolidating the position, fearing that the opponent will invade, will inevitably delay the battle. The place of setting up the game doesn't necessarily have to be the territory you want. It is fine as long as it is the battlefield you choose. The key is to seize the key point and gain the advantage, even if it is only a corner. As long as it succeeds, you will be able to occupy the high ground and break through, like a hot knife through butter." Hu Yuanli stroked his beard and gave Yang Fan a meaningful look. He asked, "I wonder which corner General Yang is going to place this piece on." Yang Fan tapped a corner of the chessboard with his fingers. Hu Yuanli's eyes narrowed, thinking that Yang Fan was about to reveal the mystery. But he saw Yang Fan shake his head calmly and said, "Buddha said, I can't say. In a luxurious bedroom, the furniture, lighting, and silk bedding all showed the wealth of this family. Although it wasn't winter yet, there was already a brazier in the luxurious bedroom, and the air was warm. A graceful beauty was sitting in front of the dressing table. Her beautiful long hair was draped over her smooth and white back. Behind her was a thin string tied with an Angela's muffin, covering her full breasts. On her slender waist was a pair of jade-colored panties, faintly revealing the alluring color of her flesh. Her face was reflected in the bright bronze mirror. It was a delicate and alluring face, as tender and beautiful as a flower that had just bloomed. As soon as June Rian entered the room, she saw her enchanting and lovely appearance, and her lower abdomen immediately heated up. June Rian was in her early 30s and was a former supervisor of the Imperial College. She was one of the 3 deputy leaders of the Flood Dragon Union, mainly in charge of accounting and dealing with the government. This woman was his second wife, who he had only married for half a month. Although she came from a small family, she was extremely beautiful and gentle. He loved her very much. Just now, June Rian went to meet with the gang leader to discuss how to deal with the peerless master of the Shun Gate. He planned to go to the city early the next morning and ask Adjunct Chu if there were any influential families involved. As long as there were no officials involved, it didn't matter how good that woman was at fighting. Not to mention that there were 3,000 members of the Flood Dragon Union. She couldn't fight against 3,000 people no matter how good she was at fighting. As long as there were no officials involved, that woman would fall into the trap no matter how good she was at fighting. Lang Jun, you're back? His wife saw the figure walking over from the mirror. She happened to turn around with a smile, but June Rian hugged her and threw her onto the bed. Lang Jun, you're only thinking about doing that shameful thing as soon as you're back. The woman's eyes sparkled as she spoke shyly. June Rian had already jumped forward while laughing. With this leap, the warm and fragrant jade did not fully embrace him, but his entire body was suspended in midair. A big hand suddenly appeared and grabbed his belt. June Rian was a 7-foot-tall man. When he jumped forward again, the man grabbed him and held him in the air. This arm strength was really amazing. Then, she heard a boorish man's voice with a hint of ridicule and sarcasm as he said, "I'm sorry to disturb President June's good mood. President June, do you have time to talk to me first?" June Rian turned her head in horror and saw an extremely strong man standing firmly on the ground. His outstretched arm was still grasping her belt, and his pair of big, sharp eyes were bright and full of expression. The 3 brothers of the Gu family acted at the same time on this night. In a corner outside Chong and City, they laid the first piece of this game for Yongfan. Chapter 946. Li Hei slowly walked back to his mansion and entered the guest hall. He sat down and thought about what happened today. Just as he was thinking, his daughter-in-law, Miao Qing, suddenly stumbled in. When she saw Li Hei, she shouted, "Gong Gong, you're back! You're back!" Although Li Hei was a Jianghu person, his family had always been very strict. Seeing his daughter-in-law only wearing Yanju casual clothes and her wet hair draped over her shoulders, he was very displeased. He frowned and reprimanded, "How can you be like this? That's not proper." Before he finished, his daughter-in-law burst into tears. "Grandfather, Jinyu is gone! Jinyu is gone!" Li Hei was so scared that his whole body trembled and his face turned pale. He hurriedly asked, "Gone? How did he go missing? Tell me clearly." Li Hei only had one son. He fell into the water and died while crossing the Salmon Gorge in the autumn of the year before last. Now he only had his precious grandson, Li Jinyu, who was the only bloodline of the Li family. Li Hei was now in his early 60s. Although he had many wives and concubines, it would be difficult for him to have a son. Carrying on the family line, continuing the family line, and wearing mourning clothes for him after 100 years, all depended on this baby. This precious grandson was the flesh of Li Hei's heart. He was now the 2nd deputy leader of the Jiao Dragon Society. In fact, he was the first deputy leader. He handed over the power for retirement because of his precious grandson. He used to be in charge of Chaoquan. Every year at the beginning of the year, he would go to Yangzhou and then return to Chang, and from Yangzhou he would be outside for a whole 9 months. Thousands of brothers in the society were under his command. His position was second only to Leader Win, and his real power was enough to compete with Leader Win. It was because he wanted to see his precious grandson often that he gave up his position. Now that he heard that his grandson was gone, Li Hei's blood rushed to the top of his head, and his hair stood up. He raised his hand and slapped his daughter-in-law, causing her to stumble and fall to the side. Li Hei's cheeks trembled, and he shouted fiercely, "How can Jinyu be missing? Tell me now." When the daughter-in-law saw that her father-in-law's eyes had turned red and he looked like he wanted to eat someone, she was so scared that she didn't dare to cry. She knelt on the ground and trembled as she replied, "Jinyu was sleepy, but he refused to sleep and kept saying that he wanted to wait for you to come back. I coaxed him for a long time before he fell asleep." The daughter-in-law placed him on the Kong bed and asked the wet nurse to look after him. She then went to take a bath. When the daughter-in-law returned to the bedroom, she saw that the wet nurse had fainted on the floor. Jinyu, he was gone. Boo-hoo! Li Hei was in so much pain that his heart felt like it was being cut by a knife. He was someone who had been in the pugilistic world all his life. When he heard his daughter-in-law say this, he knew that this was definitely not the work of a human trafficker. Human traffickers rarely went to someone's house and directly stole a child. Besides, what kind of place was the Li family? Even if it wasn't a dragon's pool or a tiger's den, it wasn't a place that just anyone dared to barge in. To be able to go to the Li family's house and beat the wet nurse unconscious, then take a child away without anyone knowing, how could he be a thief? Li Hei knew that the other party's target was definitely not the child, but him. However, he didn't know what the other party's goal was. If they wanted money, it wouldn't matter even if he gave up all his family's wealth as long as he could protect his eldest grandson. What he was afraid of was that the other party came for revenge. If that was the case, then his precious grandson would be in danger. After spending his entire life in the pugilistic world, Li Hei's hands were also stained with dozens of lives. Li Hei was so anxious that his chest was burning, as if he was about to spit out a mouthful of blood. At this moment, a guard from the house ran in and reported loudly, "Master Hei, little Langjun. Li Hei pounced over like a ferocious tiger and grabbed his collar. He asked with a trembling voice, "What happened to Jinyu?" The man pointed outside and said while panting, Someone came back with little Langjun." Li Hei suddenly turned his head and saw an extremely burly man who was surrounded by more than 10 thugs from the house. The man walked over with steady steps, carrying a 2- or 3-year-old child in his arms. The first deputy leader of the Flood Dragon Gang, Yan Sherwei, returned home with a gloomy face. He took off his robe and handed it to the servant girl who came to greet him. He walked into the inner room while untying the leather belt around his waist. He was originally the second deputy leader and had always accompanied the leader in Chang. In terms of status, he was ranked second. In terms of actual power, he was actually inferior to the third leader, Jun Ruyan, who was ranked below him. In the end, Li Hei handed over his power because of his son's death, so he became the first deputy leader of the Flood Dragon Gang. In the Chow Gang, the most important skills were the Chow Fist and the Chow Mouth. They were the right-hand men of the gang leader. Jun Ruyan was in charge of the Chow Mouth, while Li Hei was in charge of the Chow Fist. As the second deputy leader, his position was very awkward. He was overjoyed to be in charge of the Chow Fist. However, Li Hei had been in charge of the Chow Fist since his father's generation. The father and son had been in charge of the Chow Fist for decades and had many trusted subordinates. Although Li Hei had handed over his power, he still had great control over these Jianghu heroes. Yan Sherwei didn't live up to his title as the leader of the Chow Fist. After more than a year of hard work, he finally grasped a certain level of strength and recruited 200 to 300 people as his trusted subordinates. They were the people who wanted to annex the Shun Gang by force today. When one gang leader wanted to annex the Shun Gang, he patted his chest and took it on. He thought it would be easy to deal with the Shun Gang, but he didn't expect that he would embarrass the Flood Dragon Gang. In tonight's meeting, he wanted to immediately return the favor and gather the people of the Flood Dragon Gang to destroy the Shun Gang. However, Li Hei, who still controlled most of the force in the Flood Dragon Gang, strongly opposed it. It was obvious that he wanted to make a fool of himself. To tame those unruly Jianghu men, one had to rely on means and prestige. Li Hei didn't want to give up his power because he didn't want to lose face. Damn it, his grandson was still drinking milk. What did this old man want to do? Did he want to wait until his grandson grew up and take back the position of the Chow Fist's leader? Yan Sherwei walked around the inner room with a calm face. When he looked up, he was stunned. Under the light, a square-faced man with thick, ink-like eyebrows was sitting in front of the table. Yan Sherwei would drink a bowl of cheese every night before going to bed. At this moment, the bowl of cheese that the maid had brought was in the hands of the man, and he was enjoying it with relish. The man raised his head and stared at Yan Sherwei with a pair of eyes as sharp as an eagle's. He smiled and said, "Did Leader Yan just come back? I've been waiting for you for a long time." Yan Sherwei's horrified gaze fell from that person to the long sword on the table. He cried out in alarm and hastily retreated, shouting, "Someone come! There's an assassin! Guards, come quickly!" Following Yan Sherwei's shout, the thugs of the mansion heard the alarm and rushed into the bedroom with sticks and swords in their hands. The room was filled with crashing sounds, the sound of tables and chairs breaking, the sound of things being thrown and smashed, the sound of fists and palms colliding, the sound of weapons colliding, and the sound of shouting and cursing interweaved together. With a crack, a large hole was smashed on the wooden screen by a broken corner of the table. In just a moment, the storm-like sound stopped, and the bedroom was silent. Yan Sherwei stood in the hall, protected by 4 armed guards. Hearing the silence in the bedroom, they couldn't help but look at each other. "Go, see what's going on inside." Yan Sherwei nervously pushed the 2 guards in front of him. The 2 guards gripped their knives and braced themselves to go around the screen. They looked around and saw that the bedroom was in a mess. The 7 or 8 thugs who broke in were lying on the bed. Some are hanging limply from the top of the tent. Some are hanging upside down on the dressing table. Some are lying on the floor full of wood shavings, and one was sitting on the floor, leaning against the screen. All of them were unconscious, but the burly man who broke into the bedroom had disappeared. "Deputy Leader, that person is gone." The 2 guards looked as if they had seen a ghost. They stared the room in shock and fear, afraid that the person would suddenly jump out of nowhere like a demon. Gone? How is that possible? The only way out of Yan Sherwei's bedroom was through the central room. There were no small doors or windows, so how could a living person disappear? Yan Sherwei rushed over to take a look. Everything in the room that could be broken had been broken, and the curtain was on the ground. There was indeed no place for a person to hide. The 4 guards and Yan Sherwei looked at the room in a daze. Yan Sherwei suddenly shivered and cried out involuntarily, Could it be some kind of demon?" Someone at the side poked his head into the messy bedroom and said to Yan Sherwei, "Are there any demons or evil spirits here?" "Deputy Leader, you should invite a Taoist priest to perform a ritual." Bullsh *T. You are. Yan Sherwei was furious. He was about to turn around and scold him when he suddenly realized that the person who spoke wasn't his guard at all. The guard had fallen to the ground, unconscious. The person who was standing there and looking into the bedroom, curiously, was the man who had just disappeared from the bedroom. When the sky was about to brighten, someone impatiently knocked on the door of the vice president of the Flood Dragon Society. About half an hour later, Jun Ruyan hurriedly walked out of the house with dozens of hired thugs and rushed to Vice President Wen's house. Halfway there, they met Li Hei, who had come out from another alley. Li Hei also had a few dozen people with him. The 2 of them did not speak when they met, only nodding with cold expressions. They then cooperated and hurried towards Guild Master Wen's house. Soon, Yen Sherwei also appeared in town with dozens of thugs. All of them looked gloomy and hurried toward Leader Wen's house. The people who got up early noticed the abnormality and immediately thought of the great loss the Flood Dragon Society had suffered yesterday. Could it be that the Flood Dragon Society had set the time for them to take revenge on the Shun Gate this morning? Curiosity and excitement tickled them like a cat in lust. They all informed their neighbors and waited eagerly. However, they did not see the troops marching to the Shun Gate until the sun was high up in the sky. Instead, they received a piece of unbelievable news. When Changxing, the leader of the Flood Dragon Union, was dead. The first to discover Leader Wen's death were the 8th and 9th wives of the Wen family. Leader Wen's 8th wife and 9th wife were a pair of twin sisters. They were originally prostitutes in the martial arts world, but Leader Wen took a liking to them and took them in as his wives. Leader Wen loved having them serve him in bed. Last night, it was the two sisters who served him on the bed. Today, at dawn, when the 9th wife was about to get up, she found that Leader Wen, who had been sleeping between them, was already dead. Leader Wen was unscathed and died of old age at the age of 42. Chapter 947. The headquarters of the Flood Dragon Triad was Wen Changxing's home. The morning hall had already been set up, but because the news had just spread, there were no guests to pay their respects except for the 3 vice presidents and the stewards. The stewards gathered outside the morning hall and discussed. They had many doubts about the sudden death of President Wen. The 3 vice presidents and the young president, Wen Bin, were discussing in the living room. Wen Bin was wearing linen clothes and had a white scarf wrapped around his head. His eyes were red and swollen from crying, but the 3 vice presidents were unusually silent. Wen Bin said in a hoarse voice, "My father was so strong. How could he have died so suddenly? There must be something strange about this. Yesterday, a master came from the Shun faction. With her martial arts, she could easily kill my father. This must have something to do with her." The 3 vice presidents were still silent. Li He silently thought about his worries. Until now, he could not forget the fear and panic he felt when his grandson went missing last night. He still remembered when he snatched his precious grandson back into his arms and ordered his men to arrest the intruder. The intruder's clean and agile movements were still fresh in his mind. "If I can take your grandson away and return him to you, I can take him away again. Presently, if you want your grandson to grow up peacefully and take care of you, you'd better know what's good for you." This was what the man with amazing skills had said to him after he had defeated everyone with a wave of his hand and a kick. "What do you want me to do? Betray the Flood Dragon Triad? Hee. What I want to do doesn't conflict with your personal interests at all. I know what President Li is thinking. You want to leave a family business for your precious grandson so that he doesn't have to worry about food and clothing. No matter what I do, I can satisfy your request and give you more. Carry the injured away. Keep your mouths shut and don't leak anything. Otherwise, don't blame me for throwing your entire family into the Wei River to feed the turtles. Warrior, please talk in the study." Thinking of the conversation with the man last night, Li He let out a sigh of relief. Yen Sherwei was also thinking in silence. "President Yen, the Flood Dragon Triad belongs to the Wen family and will never be yours. You have no objections to this, right? So what? The leader of your clans, Chao Quan, is you on the surface, but it's still Li He. That's not wrong, is it? What are you trying to say? If you have to choose between death and power and wealth, which would you choose?" Yen Sherwei woke up from his recollection. He raised his eyelids slightly and glanced at Li He and Junrian. Both of them were silent with sullen faces. Other than the gang leader, these two were the most influential people in the Flood Dragon Union. However, they were surprisingly silent today, which was very different from their usual behavior. Could it be? Yen Shurei's heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the two of them met someone last night? Last night, June Ruyan had been about to pounce on the beautiful woman, only to be caught in midair by someone who could have easily killed her. June Ruyan didn't believe that Master had died a sudden death. But if Master had been killed by someone, and there were no signs of tampering, then the culprit must be too terrifying. The person who saved the Shunmen yesterday was a girl, but the person who broke into his bedroom last night was a brawny man. Where did these people come from? How many of them were there? While he was puzzled, what that person told him kept lingering in his mind. Master June, you're the leader of the Flood Dragon Union and a scholar. The fighting and killing in the Jianghu has nothing to do with you. You have connections with the government, which is your greatest asset. Only with this asset, even if the Flood Dragon Union doesn't exist, the White Dragon Union and the Black Dragon Union will still offer you a high salary. There's no need for you to stir up trouble. We Jianghu people do things very simply. We go in with a knife and come out with a knife. That's all. Master June has connections with the government. You can subdue these Jianghu people who rely on the water for a living, but you can't subdue us Jianghu people who have unknown identities. I think you understand this. What do you mean? You're different from Yen Sherwei and Li Hei. They rely on the water for a living for generations. But you're a person with an official's title. If you're lucky enough to become an official and are sent to another place, you won't be able to be the leader of the Flood Dragon Union. Or, if you lose your connections with the government, you'll still have to hand over the helm of the Flood Dragon Union. You're only a vice leader of the Flood Dragon Union for money. As long as you're willing to cooperate with us, we also need you. We Jianghu people can't deal with the government. We still have to rely on you, June Xiaolian. What do you want me to do? You don't need to do anything now. Tomorrow, you can even go to the city according to your previous agreement and listen to what Adjunct Chu has to say. We'll talk after you've made up your mind. Is that okay? Wenbin spoke angrily for a long time. Only his voice reverberated in the spacious hall. He finally felt the uneasy peace. He looked at the three vice leaders with some bewilderment. Master He, Uncle June, Uncle Yen, what do you say? Yen Sherwei was the leader of the Flood Dragon Union and ranked first among the three vice leaders. However, he was called last by Wenbin. He immediately felt uncomfortable. He said, "Don't be agitated, my good nephew. There's still no clear explanation for the death of our leader. If we act rashly against the Shun Union, we'll be in the wrong." In the wrong? Wenbin was tongue-tied. In this world, the fist is the law. When did the Flood Dragon Union ever reason with others, except when facing gangs that are stronger than them? Now the leader of the Flood Dragon Union, Yen Sherwei, actually said that they're in the wrong. What surprised him even more was that Li Hei, who had always been at odds with Yen Sherwei, actually agreed with him. That's right. What leader, Yen said, makes a lot of sense. Young leader, you don't have to be so hasty. If this is really the work of the Shun Union, we have to seek justice. But before that, we have to find out more about them. Wenbin finally realized that something was wrong. He panicked and turned to June Ruyan. Uncle June, what do you say? The corner of June Ruyan's mouth twitched slightly. She said calmly, "My good nephew, you should go outside and arrange the funeral first. The most important thing now is to take care of the gang leader's funeral. I'll go to the city to see Adjunct Chu later and find out how powerful the Shun Union is." Wenbin was furious. He clenched his fists and was about to object when Li Hei and Yen Sherwei both stood up. Vice Leader June is right. Let's do that. Then, without waiting for Wenbin's reply, the three of them turned and walked out in unison. Wenbin stared blankly at their backs, a chill creeping into his heart. The first mate's white silk hung on the walls of the living room, fluttering in the wind. Wenbin was the only one left in the living room. Looking at his pale face, it seemed that he was the one who should be the one in charge of the funeral. How could this be? How could this be? What are those three old fellows trying to do? Could it be? A frightening thought suddenly welled up in his mind. but he immediately dismissed it. Impossible. It couldn't be that they coveted his position as gang leader. The special system of the Chow gang ensured its stability, making it difficult for others to usurp its position. Firstly, the Chow gang wasn't the only gang. There were other Chow gangs. You could be rude to outsiders, but internally, if you dared to disregard seniority and betray your master, you would be rejected by all the gangs. Unless you had the power to stand above all the other gangs and didn't need to care about them. But ever since the last years of the Sui dynasty, no Chow gang had been able to dominate the martial world. Moreover, the Chow gang was divided into civil and military. The Chow gang and the Chow gang were inseparable and mutually restricted each other. There was only one gang leader, and the Chow gang were second only to the gang leader, who would support the other to the position without any benefits for themselves. Thus, the Chow gang and the Chow gang could never work together. Moreover, the Wen family not only had great influence within the gang, but also outside. The daughter of the Heavenly Eagle gang's leader had just been betrothed to him, and the Heavenly Eagle gang wasn't any weaker than the Flood Dragon gang. With the help of such a powerful father-in-law who could overturn the gang. Thinking of this, Wenbin calmed himself down and slowly walked out. Jun Rian returned to the city today to ask Chu Tianqing about the Chow gang's background. At the same time, she had to report the death. Of course, she had to report the major changes to the Flood Dragon gang to Adjunct Chu Tianqing. As for offering condolences, Adjunct Chu wouldn't go. The disciples of the Chow gang were different from the underworld and the forest gangs. In the eyes of the underworld and the forest gangs, the emperor was nothing but a fart. The business they did made them enemies of the court, but the Chow gang was different. Their rice bowls were in the hands of the government. They could do whatever they wanted in the relatively closed circle of the Chow gang, but in the eyes of the government, they were soft persimmons that could be squeezed as they pleased. When passing by Qixia Gate, Jun Ruyan reined in his horse. Putting aside his identity as a member of the Chow gang, he was also a scholar with scholarly honors. No gatekeeper dared to make things difficult for him when he passed through the city gates. However, there was a large group of soldiers entering the city, so he could only stop and wait. The endless stream of soldiers seemed to have traveled a long way to get here. From the war horses, weapons, and uniforms, they didn't seem like ordinary garrisons. As Jun Rian watched, many officials in Yamen uniforms appeared in the procession. Behind them, there were several carriages with official banners on them. The imperial censor, the director of the Ministry of Justice, sitting in the carriage, who Yuanli stroked his beard and smiled. Ha! No one from the Chang and government came to welcome us. General Yang, this show of strength has made us look bad. Yang Fan smiled. Since the Lord of Hanoi has arrived in Chang, and first, you should have expected this. If they don't give us a welcome, we'll do it ourselves. Ha! Tonight at Pinkong Square, I'll treat you. How about it? Hu Yuanli's eyes lit up. Pinkong Square? Great. I've long heard of Pinkong Square. I heard that it's no worse than Luoyangsting Square. There are many enchanting and charming golden cats there. Chun Dong, who was dozing off, suddenly perked up. He coughed and said, "Golden cats? General Yang, I can't refuse your good intentions. I must go and see for myself." Ha! You're such an introverted slut. They talked and laughed as they drove into the city. Jun Rian immediately stood by the side of the road, completely unaware that the disturbance on Ba was caused by the young man in the carriage. This disturbance was destined to sweep through the whole of Chang. And this was just the beginning. Chapter 948. Pinkong Square was diagonally opposite the 6 ministries of the Chang, an imperial court and many government offices. With the geographical advantage, it was convenient for the officials to enter and exit, visit prostitutes, and feast. In the Tang dynasty, officials were not allowed to visit prostitutes, and it was a fashion. Officials were the main force of visiting brothels. No wonder Pinkong Square became the center of Chang and city's brothel. The Central Plains women who could serve wine in Pinkong Square were not only beautiful and elegant, but also had a beautiful mind. They were good at zither, chess, calligraphy, painting, poetry, and songs. The women from the western region were not good at literature, but they were good at singing and dancing. They only knew how to do sex, so there was no place for them here. However, at this moment the Chang'an officials, gentry, and old people of aristocratic families were gathered together. But there was no beautiful girl hung, reciting poems, nor was there a western region concubine dancing. The one who was pacing slowly in front of the crowd was a short, skinny man in his 50s. He was the king of Hanoi, Wu Yizong. Wu Yizong knew that Yang Fan and his group would arrive in Chang, and today, so he invited all the influential people in Chang and in advance. Since the king of Hanoi had sent an invitation, no one would reject it. Therefore, the prefectural magistrate of Chang and Lu Xiantian, all the senior officials of the capital, the royal family and the local gentry, and old people of aristocratic families were all present. The sage may come back to Chang, and for a while next year, so I will go first. The palace needs to be repaired, the roads need to be leveled and widened, the rivers need to be dredged, and there can't be any problems with the transportation. I will be accompanied by all the civil and military officials and tens of thousands of elite soldiers. I can't afford to have a lack of food supply. Wu Yizong purposely wanted to embarrass Yang Fan and the officials from the Ministry of Justice and the censorate, delaying these people from welcoming him. But this kind of discord, it was good enough that everyone was aware of it. Naturally, he could not say it out loud, so he found an excuse for himself. Thus, the banquet turned into a lecture. The Ministry of Revenue and the Ministry of Works have both sent people over to assist me in reorganizing the old capital. The local officials of Chang and the generals of the garrison, the members of the royal family, the gentry, and the elders of the rich and powerful families, please cooperate with me. If anyone is incompetent or tries to drag me down during this process, I will tell you the ugly truth. Don't blame me for being ruthless then. Ha ha ha, hall full of beauties, it's dazzling. Nanny Hu, your silk flower shop really lives up to its reputation. I think it can be considered the #1 shop in Ping Kong Lane. Come, come, come. Quickly invite the ladies to dance Huxian for us. Huxian has to be performed by Hu Ji to be considered authentic. Just as Wu Yizong finished speaking, a burst of laughter came from the other side. Turning his head, Wu Yizong couldn't help but widen his eyes. Separated by a low wall was the adjacent silk flower shop. It was also on the second floor and was also the largest room. The windows were wide open, and the people inside looked to be sitting on the side, not facing this side. The window was also drawn with an almost transparent curtain. Several people were sitting inside, and their faces could be seen clearly at a glance. The person in the middle was surprisingly Yang Fan. Yang Fan had Su Liang Ma Chiao, and the others lead the 3 armies to the Xuanwu Gate in Chang, an imperial palace. In the past, there had been barracks for the imperial army outside the Xuanwu Gate. Now it naturally belonged to them. However, ever since the emperor moved the capital to Luoyang, the barracks had been unoccupied for a long time and had fallen into disrepair. The Ministry of Works had to send people to repair it, so they could only make do with it. Under Hu Yuanli and Chen Dong's arrangements, the officials from the censorate and the Ministry of Justice also stayed in the Chang, and government office that belonged to that office. On the other hand, Yang Fan dragged Chen Dong, Sun Yuxuan, Hu Yuanli, Shi Yu, Wen Ao, and the others to Pingkong Square. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but the place they had chosen was adjacent to the place where Wu Yizong was holding his banquet. Although they were separated by a wall and belonged to 2 different brothels, the sounds of music could be heard and the movements of the dancers could be seen. It was as if they were fighting in a ring. Wu Yizong had never imagined that when Yang Fan and the others arrived in Chang, and with their tails between their legs, not a single official from Chang, and would come out to welcome them. Instead of feeling indignant, they were actually enjoying themselves here, and coincidentally appeared next to him. Du Guyu, who was seated, quickly swept his gaze over the guests present. seeing that everyone had a strange expression on their faces. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. In the She flower shop, when the madam saw that this customer was so generous, she happily agreed to make arrangements. Very soon, the servants filed in a line. 8 delicacies of water and land were laid out, and the table was filled with sumptuous dishes. Immediately after, 8 blonde, blue-eyed, snow-white, high-nosed women spread out and prepared to dance. These girls were all dressed in light tunics, wearing colorful beaded hats, and had grape-patterned long belts draped over their shoulders, revealing their enchanting, slender waists. For a moment, the entire hall was filled with an enchanting and exotic charm. They first greeted Yang Fan and the others in the Hu language. Their voices were like that of an oriole, and it was unknown what they were saying, but their voices were extremely euphemistic and pleasant to the ears. Following that, the musicians who had already taken their seats in the 2 rooms began to play, and the 8 Hu girls danced to the cheerful and powerful music. They raised their eyebrows and moved their eyes on the flowered carpet. Their beaded hats slanted in red sweat. They leaned to the east and fell to the west in drunkenness, their boots frail before the lamp. Their circling and hurrying steps were all in response, their hands on their hips like the moon. Hu Xian's music was lively and vigorous. It was originally more suitable for men to dance, but when the women danced, there was a kind of valiant and heroic bearing amidst their vigor. Coupled with their enchanting charm, the pointed hats and pointed chins gave them an even more enchanting flavor that could directly hook people's hearts. From beginning to end, Yang Fan did not even glance over the wall, as if he did not know that Wu Yizong was just a wall away from the opposite brothel. Even Hu Yuanli, Qin Dong, and the others only cared about stroking their beards and watching the dance, chatting cheerfully and wittily. None of them looked over. Since the team had already stood, there was no need to think about turning back. To be able to reach their current positions, there were also people who had toiled in officialdom for half their lives. How could they not understand this principle? At this moment, they were in a dilemma and had no way out. Instead, they had even lost their strength of character and integrity. Moreover, deliberately delaying the Chang and officials and preventing them from welcoming the 1,000 cavalrymen, the censorate, and the Ministry of Justice, although it was a disgrace to them, as a dignified prince, such a move was too narrow-minded. How could these people not be angry in their hearts? Wu Yizong stared blankly for a long time before fiercely turning back. His footsteps became heavier, and his tone also contained a kind of uncontrollable anger. I will be in charge of the Chang and palace, streets, roads, and transportation together with Assistant Minister Chiu of the Ministry of Revenue and Assistant Minister Ho of the Ministry of Works. Everyone, ha ha ha, good. Good dancing, good singing, good speaking. Beauty, you have worked hard. I will reward you with a cup. A burst of loud laughter interrupted Wu Yizong's words. Wu Yizong coldly turned back and saw Yang Fan raising his cup, waving and laughing at a Hu girl. This Hu Ji was dancing. But when did she ever sing, and when did she ever say it? If the 2 seats were completely unrelated, it would be fine for Yang Fan to say so. Now that the 2 hosts were clearly showing signs of conflict, Yang Fan's words seemed to be mocking Wu Yizong. Wasn't Wu Yizong trying his best to step forward, wave his arms, and reprimand loudly? Wu Yizong's face turned green and red, but he could only listen to what Yang Fan said. Yang Fan did not give him a chance to talk. If he angrily went forward to talk, what crime would he be charged with? Moreover, after the last encounter in the tenderness workshop, Wu Yizong knew that Yang Fan would not care about his life when he was angry, so he was indeed not afraid of him. At that time, not only would he not be able to do anything to Yang Fan, but it would also play into his heart. Since you are all here, and since you have met, shouldn't you welcome me? At that time, he, the dignified king of Hanoi, would also become a guest to welcome him, and raise Yang Fan's status for no reason. After the Hu Xian ended, the music changed to soft silk music. 2 beautiful Hu girls sang and danced in front of the hall. The 2 girls were bright and enchanting, and their faces were full of smiles. They danced calmly, and their steps were light, like willow branches swaying in the wind. The other 6 beautiful girls changed their clothes and scattered to the seats. They sat in front of Yang Fan, Qin Dong, and the others respectively, holding a giant cup and gently urging them to drink. Yang Fan, Sun Yuxuan, and Shuri were still fine. Their behavior was a bit more reserved. But Qin Dong and Hu Yuanli, the 2 old perverts who had just encountered such delicacies of the land and sea, how could they still control themselves? They had already let the beauty Hu Ji sit on their knees, not afraid of crushing their old arms and legs. Their hands even reached into the girl's full, snow-white chest. They drank the wine, but they had to drink it with the beauty's leather cup. They ate the food, but they had to ask the beauty to feed them with chopsticks. The kind of sensual energy formed a strong contrast with the people on the other side of the wall, who had not even touched their food or wine, who only cared about listening to Wu Yizhong's boastful lecture, which formed a strong contrast. Even when Ao, the imperial judge, was a little restrained in the beginning, but when he saw the ugly behavior of the others, he threw caution to the wind. He was just a small imperial judge. How could the king of Hanoi know him? If he did not stand on the side now, he would be the first to die. Thinking of this, the imperial judge made up his mind and decided to get drunk today. The beauty who had just finished her dance, with a pink neck and sweaty cheeks, smiled sweetly and put a mouthful of the wine into his mouth. The imperial judge immediately hugged the plump girl's soft waist, and his other hand reached into her breasts, grabbed the soft and big ball, and as the girl moaned, he sucked on the tip of her tongue. Such an evil appearance made Wu Yizhong so angry that 1 Buddha was born and 2 Buddhas ascended to the heavens. If he continued, and Yang Fan was enjoying the song and dance, with his mocking words, it would make him look like a dancer who was singing and dancing in front of the guests. If he sat down and called the Hu girls to sing and dance, it would feel like he was imitating the other party and he would be at a disadvantage. Wu Yizhong was in a dilemma. After all the forces in Ba heard the news that the leader of the Flood Dragon Triad, when Changxing had died, all the influential people from different gangs and factions came to pay their condolences. Even the gangs that were not on good terms with the Flood Dragon Triad came. No matter how bad the relationship was, it was not to the point where they would kill each other. Death was a big deal, and they should come to pay their condolences. Of course, the gangs that were more powerful than the Flood Dragon Triad, and the gangs that were not on good terms with the Flood Dragon Triad, could send someone to represent them. Everyone knew that it was not because of the dead leader, but because they wanted to find out how he died. Seeing was believing. The leader of the Sky Eagle Triad is here. There was a sudden commotion among the mourners, and they spontaneously made way for him. A middle-aged man in a black robe with a long beard, thick eyebrows, and wide mouth walked over slowly with a group of people. The people behind him were all important figures in the Sky Eagle Triad, including Su Lin, the helmsman of the Tsauko. In addition, there was a young woman who looked to be about 17 or 18 years old. She was slender and wore a jade gown and a jade skirt. When she walked, a white silk skirt that covered her legs could be vaguely seen. Her snow-white silk sleeves were narrow and tight, and her hands were wrapped in copper wristbands. She was dressed like a martial artist. The girl in martial arts clothes had a slim waist, a round chest, and long legs. Although she was only 5 or 6 out of 10, her figure could be rated 8 out of 10. However, she had thin lips and high cheekbones, which made her look a little mean. Her almond-shaped eyes were also slightly slanted out of habit, which made her look domineering. This person was Wei Xiaoxiao, the daughter of the leader of the Sky Eagle Triad, Wei Yongtang. "Father-in-law, Xiaoxiao, you're here." When Wenbin saw them, he was overjoyed to welcome them as if he had seen a family member. Wei Yongtang nodded and patted Wenbin's shoulder lightly. He glanced at Li He and Yen Sherwei, who were wearing mourning belts, and said in a deep voice, "Have you found out the cause of leader Wen's death?" From his tone, it seemed that he could take over the Flood Dragon Triad as soon as when Changxing died. Li He was secretly displeased, but he replied indifferently, "There are no wounds on him, and there's no poison in his body. We can't find any cause of death." Wei Xiaoxiao interrupted, "What cause of death? We just made enemies with the Shun Triad yesterday, and something happened to Uncle Wen today. It's obviously the doing of the Shun Triad." Wei Xiaoxiao smiled coldly and raised her eyebrows even higher. "You should go and destroy the Shun Triad now. Pick out that bitch's tendons and sell her to a brothel. Tie the 3 brothers of the Qiao family to stones and throw them into the river. More than 2,000 brothers of the Flood Dragon Triad are just watching. Aren't you afraid that the heroes of the world will laugh at you?"